Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me into a world often hidden in the folds of silk curtains and behind gilded palace doors. A world where beauty is a currency, silence is survival, and power wears the softest smile. This is not a fairy tale, though it might feel like one at times. It is the story of what it could truly mean to live the life of a concubine in an imperial court, lavish, treacherous, and heartbreakingly lonely. You may have read historical accounts. You may have heard whispers of empresses, courtesans, or favorite consorts. But tonight I ask, could you survive such a life? Let us begin in the quietest way possible, with the rustle of robes in the early morning air, and a young girl being taken from everything she knows toward a destiny she never asked for. The sky was still veiled in indigo when she was roused from her straw mat. There was barely enough light to see the silhouette of her mother, silent and still, kneeling by the door. The girl's name was Linhua. She was 14, and today she was to be taken to the palace. No one had told her exactly what would happen there, just that it was an honor, a word that had sounded like a lie even to her youthful ears. She had seen the Imperial recruiter ride into the village 2 days before, his robes bright crimson, his scroll filled with the names of girls of good breeding and adequate beauty. Linhua didn't know what made her name worthy of ink. She was quiet, small, and plain compared to some of the merchant daughters. But the recruiter had glanced at her only once and nodded. That was enough. And now, her mother didn't cry. That was the part that confused her most. Her mother, who had cried when Linhua once fell from a tree and scraped her knee, who cried at the sound of old songs. Now she was silent, dry-eyed, her hands folded tightly over her lap. Linhua was given a set of new clothes, plain blue silk, no embroidery. Her long black hair had been oiled and brushed until it shone like obsidian. She had never worn silk before. It whispered around her legs like something that didn't belong to her. The cart they put her in was dark and smelled of lacquer and camphor. She was not alone. There were 6 other girls, some older, some younger. One of them was already crying softly. Linhua felt the sound hook itself into her spine. She looked out at the village one last time through the curtain. Her home was already shrinking behind her. It would be years before she saw that horizon again. The outer palace was not made for dreams. That was Linhua's first impression. It was a compound of stone and silence, with guards that did not smile and eunuchs that moved like whispers. They were herded, like livestock, to a side courtyard, where an elderly woman in a stiff purple robe looked them over like produce at the market. "You'll call me Mistress Shu," the woman said. "I will teach you how to breathe without offense, how to smile without promise, and how to walk as though the earth itself thanks you for not touching it." One girl giggled nervously. Mistress Shu didn't even look in her direction. A flick of her hand and a tall eunuch stepped forward. The girl was gone before the others even realized what had happened. No explanation, just gone. "Do not laugh," Mistress Shu said. Linhua felt her blood cool like river water. Their training began the next morning, and it was brutal in its softness. There was no yelling, no beatings, but the girls were stripped of names, now only called by numbers. Linhua was 9. They were forbidden from using certain words even in their thoughts. The palace was not big, it was vast. The emperor was not handsome or kind. He was heavenly. Every phrase, every movement was memorized like scripture. Meals were sparse but beautifully arranged. Rice in delicate porcelain bowls, fish steamed in lotus leaves. None of them dared leave a single grain uneaten. There were classes in poetry, calligraphy, the art of folding letters without creasing them, of pouring tea in perfect silence. They were taught to read the faces of eunuchs, because concubines survived not by knowing the emperor's moods, but by reading the winds of the inner court. Some girls left, illness, disobedience, accidents. The courtyard grew quieter. Linhua didn't ask where they went. Weeks passed, or maybe months. There was no calendar in the quarters, and the sky was always the same pale blue above the whitewashed walls. Then one day, Mistress Shu came for her. "You will be seen," she said, not unkindly. Linhua's hands trembled as she dressed. A robe of gossamer lavender silk. Her hair was twisted into a shape she didn't recognize. Her lips painted with crushed flower paste. She felt like a stranger to herself. The walk to the Hall of Blossoms was long. She was escorted by 2 eunuchs, silent as ghosts. Her slippers made no sound on the stone. Inside, the scent of sandalwood was thick. The ceiling towered above her, painted with dragons chasing flaming pearls. But Linhua did not look up. She had been told the Emperor would arrive when he chose. If he chose. She waited on her knees, palms pressed to her thighs, back straight, eyes lowered. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then footsteps. She felt it before she heard it, a change in the air, a stillness that deepened. When the Emperor entered, she did not look at his face. She kept her eyes on the hem of his robe, which shimmered like starlight. He asked her name. She replied with her new one, 9. He asked where she was from. She said, softly, the river village in the southern province. He said she had a voice like falling rain. She did not know how to answer that. Then he told her to rise. She obeyed, and for the first time she met his eyes. He was not beautiful, not terrifying, just a man whose words would shape the course of her life, whose whims could make or break her soul. That night, Linhua was not chosen to stay, but she had been seen, and that was the beginning. Would you have survived that first night? The silence, the unknowing? Most don't. Most are forgotten before they even begin. Linhua, however, was not like most. Not yet. But she would become something else, something the palace had not prepared for. She would learn to live not as a guest of the court, nor a victim of it, but as a shadow that could walk beside power and never be burned. But for now, she returned to her quarters in silence, lavender robe fluttering like a bruised petal. And she waited. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Linhua returned to her routines, though everything felt altered, slightly tilted on its axis. The other girls noticed, of course. They didn't speak of it, but Linhua could feel their glances, a brush of hesitation when they passed her tray in the morning, a shift of weight and silence when she entered a room. It wasn't jealousy, not yet, but it was something adjacent, the kind of attention that meant she was no longer invisible. And in the palace, visibility was both a gift and a death sentence. Mistress Shu summoned her again that week, not to see the Emperor, but for something different. Linhua was taken to a small chamber lined with bronze mirrors. There she met another woman, older, dressed in robes of pure gray, the color of storm clouds that never quite broke. You may call me Madame Chi, the woman said. From now on, I will train you in something beyond etiquette. Linhua did not ask what. She listened. Madame Chi's training was nothing like Mistress Shu's. It did not involve walking, smiling, or reciting verses. Instead, she was asked questions that felt like riddles. If 2 concubines smile at you, but only one intends you harm, how will you know which? Or, the Emperor compliments your voice. A favored consort hears it. What do you do next? Linhua didn't know the answers. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she guessed. Madame Chi never corrected her. She simply nodded, as though each answer was less important than Linhua's manner of delivering it. In time, the questions changed. They became less like puzzles and more like maps. If a maidservant stumbles in the garden at the hour you normally walk, and a court official is watching, what might that mean? Or, when the Emperor's chief wife sends you a bundle of sweet pears, but your stomach turns sour, do you thank her? These were not questions you learned from books. These were the questions of survival. And through it all, Linhua's eyes became sharper, her voice softer, her silences longer. She learned the power of listening with her body still, of noticing who walked where and when, of memorizing patterns. Every concubine had a rhythm: when she bathed, how long she spent in the gardens, whom she spoke to, and with what tone. Linhua studied them, not with intent, but with instinct, like a fox learning the path of the farmer. She discovered quickly that many of the other girls had no strategy at all. They waited, hoped, smiled brightly, and gossiped when no eunuchs were near. They still thought this was about being liked, but it wasn't. Not really. In the palace, affection was a blade, one that cut both ways. The Emperor had not called for Linhua again, but he hadn't forgotten her either. She knew this because she noticed a change in the food served to her chamber. The pickled plums were now the kind from the southern provinces. Her linens were replaced with one scented faintly of sandalwood, the very scent that had clung to the hall the day she met him. These were signals, subtle, nearly imperceptible, but deliberate. Someone wanted her to be reminded. Someone wanted her prepared. One afternoon, as spring poured its perfume through the stone corridors, Linhua sat alone beneath the magnolia tree in the central courtyard. Her shadow was long, stretched thin on the tiles, a small cough behind her. It was Suyin, Concubine Suyin, known for her delicate face and silver laughter. She was favored once, though not lately. "May I sit?" Suyin asked. Linhua nodded. They said nothing for a while. Then Suyin turned to her and smiled with something that did not reach her eyes. "You remind me of myself," she said. "A long time ago." Linhua looked at her calmly. "I've heard of your music. They say the Emperor still dreams of it." Suyin gave a small, hollow laugh. "Dreams are cheap here." The breeze moved between them like a messenger neither wanted to speak to. Then Suyin's tone changed, her voice soft but sharpened. "A word of advice, little plum blossom. Do not try to be clever. The Emperor likes simplicity." Linhua tilted her head ever so slightly. "Then how did you lose him?" Suyin's mouth didn't move, but her eyes narrowed, just for a second. It was the first time Linhua realized she had power, not from rank nor from favor, but from knowing the unspoken things, the weight of a question, the price of a look. Suyin stood. She adjusted the silk at her wrist and smiled again, that same unchanging smile. "You'll see," she whispered. "It's not the Emperor you have to fear." Linhua watched her walk away, each step measured, each sway of her sleeve calculated. The magnolia blossoms dropped silently onto the stones like snow no one could feel. That night, Linhua found her slippers replaced with a new pair, embroidered with a single peony bloom, gold thread on white silk, a gift from someone she had never met. No name, no message, but she knew what it meant. She was being watched now, closely, carefully, and perhaps not just by the Emperor. Somewhere in the palace, someone had chosen to draw her into the game, and it was no longer a matter of whether she would be summoned again, but when and under whose terms. She did not tremble. Instead, Linhua lay in bed and watched the moon carve silver across her ceiling. This was not a story of falling in love. It was the beginning of something colder, something that would ask her to give more than beauty. It would ask her to give herself, and she would do it with eyes wide open. The palace awoke slowly, always in gradients. Light filtered through silk screens and pale ribbons brushing against gold-flecked floors. A distant flute played in the servants' quarter. The air was thick with the scent of steamed lotus seeds and morning ink, freshly ground for calligraphy practice. Linhua rose before the bell. It had become her habit, no longer to train, but to observe. She had learned the rhythm of the court better than she'd ever known her childhood village. She knew when the birds began singing, the consorts would begin their grooming. She knew that the Empress's steward passed through the eastern corridor precisely 20 minutes before the first court assembly. That a certain eunuch lingered at the well house, not for thirst, but for whispers. And now she knew the Emperor would call for her again. It was not a certainty spoken aloud. There were no letters, no royal decrees, just signs, tiny gestures in the script of palace life. Her favorite tea, long absent, returned to her tray. The court tailor requested her measurements again, this time for a robe stitched with phoenix feathers. The phoenix, a dangerous symbol in a palace like this. Her chambermaid, a young girl named Ruo, tried not to show her worry, but her fingers trembled each morning as she brushed Linhua's hair. Linhua did not ask why. She understood. To rise was to fall. That was the oldest law of the court. That evening the summons came. A white scroll rolled and tied with a red silk thread. No seal, no name, only the two characters, Ingzhao, to attend. She said nothing as Ruo helped her dress. The robe was silver gray, the color of river fog at dawn. Her hair was coiled in a soft twist adorned with a single comb of mother of pearl. No perfume, no jewels. She was to be simple, a quiet bloom. They led her through corridors dimmed with lantern light, through a gate she had not passed before. It opened into a private courtyard, smaller, but more ornate than any she had seen. The air buzzed with stillness, the hall of inner reflections. It was a place known only through rumor, where the Emperor dined in solitude, entertained without audience. He was already seated when she entered, not on a throne, but on a cushioned platform beneath a curtain of gauze. He looked up as she bowed, his gaze unreadable. "Rise," he said, voice low and even. She did. He studied her face for a moment, then, without a word, gestured to the space beside him. She approached and sat as taught, back straight, eyes downcast, hands like folded petals. Do you remember the first time I saw you? He asked. Yes, Your Majesty. You were silent. Most girls chatter. She offered a slight smile. I find silence more revealing. He chuckled, a dry, thoughtful sound. Indeed. Dinner was brought out by a single eunuch. Dishes of simplicity, steamed carp, bamboo shoots, rice congee with goji berries. The emperor spoke little, but he watched her closely. She understood that tonight was not about pleasure. It was about assessment. He was weighing her, not with scales but with silences, testing her restraint, her grace, her ability to be present without pressing. At one point, he gestured toward the inkstone beside him. Do you write? Yes, Your Majesty. Then write something. The eunuch placed a scroll before her. Linhua took the brush and paused. Then she began to write, not a poem but a proverb. A willow bends where oak breaks. She handed it to him. The emperor's brow arched slightly. He read it twice. You are clever, he murmured. No more than the trees, Your Majesty. He smiled then, a real one, brief, fleeting, but unmistakable. It was enough. He dismissed her with a nod, no words, no command to stay, no offer of silk or jade or title. But she knew what it meant. She had passed. She walked back alone that night. The corridors felt different, as though the palace were subtly tilting toward her, acknowledging her shift in status. Back in her chamber, Ruo waited, kneeling. Did he? The girl began. Linhua shook her head. No, not yet. But he would. That night she did not sleep. Not because of fear, but because of clarity. She was no longer just a name on a scroll, a girl among many. She was now someone to be considered, and others would notice. The palace ran on attention, who had it, who wanted it, and who would destroy to reclaim it. The next morning, the first blow arrived. A hairpin, sharp as a knife, found in her pillow. Jade inlay, a design she recognized. Suyin's. Linhua held it in her hand for a long time, then placed it in a box beneath her bed. She said nothing to Ruo. This was the second law of survival. Do not flinch when struck. Let them wonder what you'll do. Let them wait. She went about her day as usual, bathed, read, took tea in the garden, and when she passed Suyin in the corridor that evening, she stopped just for a moment. Your hairpin, she said softly, was beautiful. Suyin froze, then smiled. Thank you, she said. It suits you. Their eyes met. It was the kind of look that meant everything and nothing. A duel without swords. Linhua walked on, not because she had won, but because she was still standing. And in the world of concubines, that was the greatest victory of all. Snow came late that year. It fell like ash over the tiled rooftops, softening the harsh lines of the palace walls. The courtyards turned white, blanketed in a quiet that muffled footsteps and secrets alike. Snow in the Imperial city was seen as auspicious, a cleansing, a blessing. But for Linhua, it felt more like a veil, hiding what waited beneath. Her days changed subtly after that second audience with the emperor. She was moved to a new wing, closer to the inner court, though not within it. A promotion in all but name. Her meals became richer, the fabrics finer, her chamber slightly larger, with silk partitions embroidered with cranes in flight. She was given a new title, court lady of the third rank. Not yet a consort, but the gate had opened. Still, there was no announcement, no open favor. The emperor had not called her again, and that made her dangerous. In the world of concubines, obscurity was safety, favor was power, and ambiguous attention, uncertain, budding, blooming, was the most volatile condition of all. Linhua understood this. She did not gloat, nor alter her behavior. She greeted the other women with perfect politeness, participated in poetry readings and embroidery circles with practiced serenity, and she watched. Every conversation had a purpose, every compliment a weight. No one spoke without motive, especially not concubine Leon. Leon was quiet, poised, always draped in pale green, the color of willow leaves. She had once been the emperor's favorite years ago, when she was barely 17. Now older, though still in her prime, she carried herself like a ghost of former glory, always polite, never involved in petty alliances. It was Leon who approached her one evening in the library. I hear you've caught his eye, she said softly, as though she were merely observing the weather. Linhua, seated cross-legged before a stack of historical treatises, looked up and smiled. I was summoned once. I'm sure it was out of curiosity. Leon knelt beside her. She was taller, her posture effortlessly regal. Curiosity is the root of many downfalls, she murmured. Linhua said nothing. She waited. You're clever, Lian continued, running her fingers along the binding of an old text. Not like the others. That can be a blessing. But here, her voice trailed off. She turned to meet Linhua's eyes. Here, it can also be a sentence. Linhua held her gaze. I've always preferred sharp tools to dull ones, even if they cut. Lan smiled faintly. Not approval. Not quite amusement either. Something else. A quiet acknowledgement. Then she stood, gave a polite nod, and left. After that night, Linhua began to notice small things. The garden paths she frequented were often swept just before she arrived. Her favorite seat in the tea house pavilion was always unoccupied, even when the other cushions were taken. And the elder eunuch assigned to her wing, Master Han, began delivering her books she hadn't requested. Poetry from the southern dynasties, letters from past empresses, medical texts about tonics and teas for vitality. Nothing in the palace was accidental. The emperor was watching her still. But so were others. One morning, a maidservant, older than most, with a mole beneath her right eye, spilled hot water near Linhua's feet. Ruo screamed and lunged forward to block the splash, burning her own arm in the process. The servant fell to her knees, weeping apologies, though Linhua noticed she never looked up once. Later that day, the maid was gone. Ruo's arm was bandaged in silk. I don't think it was an accident, Ruo whispered, eyes glistening. Linhua sat beside her and gently touched her hand. You're very brave, she said. She didn't say what she was thinking, that the girl had just saved her life. Poison was rare in the palace, but boiling water, a scalded foot, a burn that kept one from being summoned, it was a quiet, deniable strike. That evening, Linhua sent a folded note, unsigned, unsealed, to Mistress Shu. It contained one sentence: the mole under the eye should be watched. The next morning, that servant's name was struck from the registry. Linhua didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She spent that day in her chambers, tending to Ruo, sipping osmanthus tea, watching the snow melt slowly outside her lattice windows. Later, in the stillness of dusk, there was a knock. Not a eunuch, not a maid, but Madame Chi. She entered without ceremony, closing the door softly behind her. I hear you've made new friends, she said, voice even. I try to be agreeable, Linhua replied. And enemies? Linhua looked up. I try to be necessary. Madame Chi's lips curved. Just barely. You're ready, she said. When he calls again, it will not be to test you. Linhua nodded, though she felt something turn inside her. A slow, coiling thread of apprehension. She had waited for this moment, trained for it, but it still felt like stepping off a ledge. Madame Chi drew closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Remember this. Power does not live in the Emperor. It lives in those who can shape him without leaving fingerprints. Then she was gone. That night, Linhua slept with one hand tucked beneath her pillow, the jade hairpin from Suyin still hidden there, not out of fear, but as a reminder. This life was not about love, not about beauty. It was about staying awake while everyone else dreamed. And the real storm had only just begun. The lanterns in the East Hall burned low that evening, their glow gentle as candlelight behind gauze. Linhua stood still in front of the bronze mirror, her hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. The summons had come again, not with ceremony, no fanfare, just a folded strip of parchment, slipped between the pages of a book left outside her door. The characters were spare, intimate. Tonight, the Pavilion of Falling Stars. There was no title, no seal, but there didn't need to be. She knew the Emperor's handwriting now, neat, understated, a calligraphy that spoke of control, not flourish. Ruo was silent as she dressed her. The girl had recovered, though the bandages on her arm remained. Her eyes were watchful, tense, and she did not smile. Linhua knew what she wanted to ask, knew she wouldn't. In the palace, loyalty often came with silence. The robe chosen was ivory, woven with a faint sheen that caught the light like pearl dust. No jewelry. Her hair was left partially unbound, cascading over one shoulder, pinned with only a single plum blossom comb. A nod, perhaps, to where she had come from, or to what she could become. The Pavilion of Falling Stars was hidden behind a screen of trees in the north quarter of the gardens. Few were permitted there. Linhua had never seen it, only heard the name spoken in whispers. A place for the Emperor's true solitude, a place no one entered without leaving something behind. The path was snow-dusted, the stones slick beneath her embroidered shoes. She walked slowly, flanked by two silent eunuchs, each bearing a lantern lit with steady flame. Her breath came in faint clouds, vanishing before they reached the trees. When she reached the pavilion, it took her breath. It was built like a scholar's retreat, yet impossibly elegant. Wooden beams carved with celestial patterns. A single frozen pond stretched before it, moonlight caught on its surface like silk stretched taut. Bamboo rustled faintly in the wind. A stillness enveloped everything, deep, endless. Inside, warmth embraced her. A brazier burned in the corner, its scent soft and unfamiliar, jasmine mingled with sandalwood. Candles lit the room, casting a honey glow over the low table where the emperor sat. He did not wear his ceremonial robes tonight. Instead, a simple dark cloak over layered silks. He looked less like the son of heaven and more like a man lost in thought. "You came," he said. Linhua bowed low, graceful. "You called." He gestured to the seat beside him. She moved with quiet elegance and settled down, folding her legs beneath her. For a long moment, they did not speak. The silence was not tense. It was almost tender, as if both were waiting to remember how to speak like ordinary people. Then he turned toward her and said, "You look cold." She shook her head. "I'm not." Still, he reached for a folded shawl beside him and placed it gently around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her collarbone, brief, feather-light. "You're different," he murmured, "from the others." Linhua offered a small smile. "I come from a different world." He nodded. "Tell me about it." And so she did. Not everything, just pieces. She told him of her river village, of the way the mist hung over the fields at dawn, of her mother's hands, worn and calloused but warm, of the sound of rain on a thatched roof, of silence in the mountains. He listened, really listened. His gaze did not drift. His hands were still, his face unreadable. "I envy that life," he said at last. "Before this, I imagined being a scholar, just a man with books, a garden." "You still can be," Linhua said gently, "in moments." He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, something softer, quieter than she had expected. They drank tea, poured from a jade pot etched with clouds. He asked her to recite something. She chose an old poem, simple and lyrical. "The moon sets behind the cypress, the frost clings to the moss. Two shadows on the bridge say nothing and are lost." When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "Do you fear this place?" She met his eyes. "I fear what it makes of people." He leaned closer, not threatening, just closer. "And what does it make of you?" "I don't know yet," she whispered, "but I intend to choose." That made him smile. Not amused, impressed perhaps, or surprised. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bamboo leaves. The emperor stood and crossed to the far wall, pulling aside a silk panel to reveal a painted screen. Stars falling through a midnight sky. Gold flake on black lacquer, a constellation myth lost to time. "This was painted for my grandfather," he said. He believed that when stars fell, the heavens were listening. Linhua stood beside him. They stared at the panel, side by side, two figures surrounded by warmth and secrets. "Do you think they're listening now?" she asked. "I think," he said softly, "they're watching." Then he turned to her fully. Not as a ruler, not even as a man seeking companionship, but as someone looking into the eye of a storm and wondering if it could ever be tamed. He lifted her hand, held it gently. "You may stay tonight," he said, "not a command, an invitation." She did not tremble. She did not blush. She looked at him long and steady, and she nodded. When morning came, she was no longer just a court lady. She was someone who had stepped into the inner circle of the emperor's world, and now nothing she did would go unnoticed again. The emperor had chosen, and the palace would answer. The days that followed passed like the hush after a thunderclap. No sound, only the echo. Linhua did not return to her previous chambers. That door was never opened again. Her belongings, what little she had, were already moved by silent hands to a private suite near the Phoenix Terrace, the residence reserved for women who had shared the emperor's bed. It was a place both revered and reviled. Inside, everything gleamed. Gold inlays on dark rosewood, curtains of sheer blue silk that fluttered even without wind. A lacquered vanity carved with cranes, a symbol of longevity. There was a hush to the space, as though it absorbed sound rather than echoed it, and a lingering fragrance, jasmine and camphor, layered like memory. Ruo was there, waiting, her eyes wide with a kind of wonder Linhua hadn't seen before. "Will I still serve you?" she asked, voice small. Linhua took her hand. "You will serve no one else." That night, the palace whispered. It always did when the emperor took a new woman to his chambers. But Linhua noticed the difference in the way the whispers moved now. It wasn't just gossip, it was speculation, calculation. She had become a variable in the great equation of power. Within 2 days, she was elevated to Zhao Yuan, first consort of the 4th rank, a position envied by dozens, feared by more. It granted her access to higher-level court events, audience with imperial in-laws, and a formal place in the hierarchy. It also made her a target. The morning after her elevation, a silver tray was delivered to her door. On it, a bowl of bird's nest soup prepared with rock sugar and red dates, a delicacy reserved for favored women. There was no note. Linhua stared at the tray for a long time, then turned to Ruo. "Bring me a swallow," the girl blinked. "Mistress?" "A swallow," she repeated. "From the garden." An hour later, Ruo returned with a small cage and a trembling bird inside. Linhua dipped a silver spoon into the soup, cooled a drop of it, and placed it on the edge of the swallow's beak. The bird drank. Then it fluttered, shuddered, and went still. Ruo gasped. Linhua closed her eyes. "Bury it in the north courtyard," she said. "No one must see." That afternoon, she sent a small gift to Concubine Lian, a comb made of bone carved with blossoms. Nothing extravagant. But in the palace, such gestures meant everything. It was not a gift. It was a message. "I know what you did, and I am not afraid." In response, no words came. But that evening, Leon passed her in the outer corridor, and their eyes met only for a moment. There was no smile, no apology, only acknowledgement. Linhua returned to her chambers and found a new servant assigned to her, an older woman, sharp-eyed, with a low voice and careful hands. "My name is An," the woman said. "I have served 3 consorts." Linhua nodded. "And how many survived?" And smiled faintly. "1." She dismissed Ruo for the night and asked Anne to stay behind. They sat together in the candlelight, Linhua curled on a low divan while Anne poured wine from a jade pitcher. "You will need allies," Anne said quietly. "I have none." "You have silence. That's a start." Linhua sipped the wine, thinking. She had no family here, no noble blood, no sisters to whisper in court, but she had something else, the Emperor's interest. And if she could shape it, not cling to it, but shape it, she might yet carve a space for herself in this dangerous theater. She would not play the role of the jealous lover, nor the helpless waif. She would be something else entirely, a mirror to the Emperor's thoughts, a reflection that deepened his own desires. To do that, she would need knowledge. So she began to listen, to the eunuchs who changed linens and served soup, to the concubines who sang lullabies they thought no one heard, to the guards whose footsteps lingered too long outside certain doors. She wrote nothing down, but her mind became a ledger. She learned which consort faked illness every 5th day to avoid court duties, who met with which dowager in the inner temple, which servant wore a hairpin gifted by a man she should never have spoken to. All of it mattered. All of it could be traded. Meanwhile, the Emperor called for her again. Then again. Sometimes for the night. Sometimes only for a moment. An hour spent in conversation, playing weichi, or watching the koi flick their tails in the garden pond. He was drawn to her calm, her restraint, the way she never asked questions, never pressed for favor. One evening as they walked side by side in the moon pavilion, he turned to her and asked, "Why don't you ever ask me for anything?" She paused. The sky above was deep indigo, lit by 1,000 silent stars. "I was taught," she said, "that one should not speak during a blessing, only receive it." He studied her for a long moment. Then he took her hand. "You are unlike anyone I've known," she smiled softly. "Then let me remain that way." The Emperor said nothing more, but his hand did not leave hers. Back in her chambers, Linhua sat awake after he left. The room was dark, save for a single lamp flickering on the floor. She was rising, and with every step up, the wind around her grew colder. But she did not waver. In a palace of women trained to seduce, to plead, to dazzle, she had chosen another path, to become indispensable, not for her beauty, not for her charm, but for the peace she brought. The way her presence silenced even the storm inside the Emperor's mind. It was the kind of power that did not shine, but rooted itself, quiet, patient, unmovable. And though no one yet said her name aloud in fear, they had begun to think it. And that was how legends began. Winter deepened. The trees in the Imperial garden stood bare, their branches like calligraphy etched in frost. Wind swept softly across the empty courtyards, carrying the scent of pine smoke and distant incense. The world had turned inward, as it always did in the coldest months. The palace too had grown quieter, but Linhua knew it was not sleep that hushed the halls, it was waiting. The emperor had fallen ill. It began with a cough, harmless, easily dismissed. But it lingered, grew heavy in his chest. His physicians circled him like bees, offering syrups and scrolls of herbal wisdom. None seemed to help. He grew pale, withdrawn. Court was delayed, audiences postponed. Rumors seeped through the seams of the palace like fog. Some whispered that it was an omen. Others believed it to be poison. Linhua did not believe in either. She believed in people. And people, she knew, rarely acted without reason. When she was summoned to the Jade Hall late one night, she did not hesitate. She moved quietly, Ruo trailing behind her like a pale shadow. The guards let her through without question. Inside, the emperor lay on a broad, low couch, his face damp with sweat. His breath rasped like wind through reeds. A physician rose from beside him and bowed low. He is resting now, but the fever rises with the moon. Linhua stepped closer. The emperor's eyes fluttered open. "Linhua?" he whispered. She knelt beside him, gently placing her hand over his. "I'm here," she said. There were no other consorts present, not even the empress. She realized with a hollow weight settling in her chest that he had asked for her by name. "Do not leave," he murmured. "They circle like crows." Linhua did not ask who he meant. She didn't need to. For 2 days and nights, she remained at his side. She did not sleep. She cooled claws with water scented with chrysanthemum. She spooned herbal broth past his lips when he could not lift his arms. She read softly. Old poems he once said reminded him of his mother's voice. And slowly, imperceptibly, his fever began to wane. When he finally slept deeply, his breath even, Linhua felt a wave of something she could not name. Relief, gratitude, and something darker, something colder. Because she knew now, if he had died, she would not have survived it. Not in the way people imagined. She would not have been poisoned or exiled, not right away, but she would have been erased, folded quietly into the archives of forgotten names. A consort without lineage, without protection, would be discarded like a faded petal once her use had passed. And there were those, she realized, who had hoped for exactly that. When the emperor was well enough to sit up, he reached for her hand again. "You didn't leave." "I had nowhere else to go," she replied softly. He smiled faintly. "That is not true. You could have chosen safety, silence. I chose you." There was a long pause. "I will remember that," he said, and she knew that he meant it. But remembering was not enough, not here, not in the shifting sands of the inner court. What she needed was to be seen not just by him, but by the ones who whispered behind the tapestries. The ministers, the dowagers, the empress herself. Her rise had been quiet, a slow unfurling, but now it had to be acknowledged, claimed, solidified. So Linhua made her first move. On the 6th day of the emperor's recovery, she requested an audience, not with him, but with the empress dowager. It was a daring choice. Some would say reckless. The empress dowager was known for her stern disposition and cold precision. She rarely granted private audiences to lower-ranked women of the harem. But Linhua was not just a consort anymore. She had nursed the emperor through his illness. Everyone knew it. The request was granted. She wore a robe of muted jade, embroidered with silver plum blossoms. Modest, respectful. Her hair was pulled back simply, pinned with a comb of plain horn. The Empress Dowager received her in a chamber warmed by 3 braziers. The walls were lined with scrolls of old mountain landscapes, their ink faded but fine. She did not rise when Linhua entered. "Speak," she said. Linhua knelt. Her voice was steady. "I come only to express gratitude, Your Majesty, for the Emperor's recovery and for the peace of the palace." The Dowager studied her with eyes sharp as frost. "You presume gratitude will shield you." "No," Linhua replied. "Only honor can do that, and I seek no more than to serve where I am allowed." A long silence. "You have learned the art of speaking without saying," the Dowager said finally. "That is dangerous." "I have learned to listen," Linhua replied, "and to remember." The Empress Dowager's lips curved, ever so slightly. "That is more dangerous still." But she did not dismiss her. Instead, she asked a question. "What do you believe the Emperor needs most now?" Linhua answered without hesitation. "Stillness." The Dowager tilted her head. "Not loyalty? Not strength?" "He has those," Linhua said. "But the court will press, the ministers will circle, there will be unrest. If I may, I wish to offer him a place without noise." The Empress Dowager regarded her for a long time. Then finally she nodded once. You may rise. And so she did. It was not a blessing, not an alliance, but it was something else. Permission. That evening, when Linhua returned to her chambers, she found a single gift waiting for her. Wrapped in silk, no note, no name. Inside, a box of ink sticks, black as night, scented faintly of pine. It was not meant for writing. It was meant for painting shadows. And Linhua understood the message. She was no longer being observed. She was now part of the game. The snow began to melt. Rivulets traced delicate lines across the stone walkways, carving paths through the frost like veins on parchment. The palace stirred from its winter trance, slow and deliberate. Plum blossoms, tentative and pale, had begun to unfurl on the older trees. They bloomed early this year, daring the cold to return. So too did the court awaken. The emperor's illness had passed, but the echo of it lingered in every corner of the inner court. Ministers who once held their breath now moved with renewed purpose. Edicts, once delayed, were now signed with decisive brushstrokes. But most noticeable of all was the change in who stood beside the throne. Linhua. Not every day, not every session, but when she did appear, quiet, poised, eyes lowered, the room shifted around her. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence had become a question the others were still learning how to answer. The emperor had not announced her elevation to noble consort, but it was assumed. He gave her the seat closest to his in private banquets. He asked her opinion in front of ministers, even if she offered only silence in return. When they walked together, he listened. Not as a ruler hears his subject, but as a man hears the one voice that tempers the rest. This, more than anything, unsettled the court. The empress said nothing publicly. She maintained her role with absolute decorum. Her ceremonies were flawless, her words measured. But Linhua noticed the shift. The late-night rituals held longer than usual. The older consort summoned more often to her quarters. The silences that grew thicker when she entered the same garden. And then came the invitation. A private tea hosted by the empress herself. Linhua did not decline. She prepared slowly that morning, choosing a robe of soft gray silk edged with palest blue. Understated, respectful. Her hair was left simple, coiled at the nape. No jewels, only a jade pendant once gifted by the emperor. She arrived at the empress's residence at the appointed hour, accompanied by a single servant and no words. The chamber of serene fragrance was high-roofed and warm, filled with afternoon light filtered through honey-colored screens. The scent of chrysanthemum and cedar lingered in the air. The empress sat alone beside a low table, pouring tea into a set of celadon cups. Her expression was tranquil, unreadable. Linhua bowed low. Your Majesty, please, the empress said. Sit. She did. There was no preamble, no small talk, only silence as the empress handed her a cup and gestured for her to drink. Linhua did so, slowly, savoring the taste, faintly bitter, like camellia with a whisper of ginseng. You have risen swiftly, the empress said at last. Linhua met her eyes calmly. I follow the emperor's path, not my own. Do you know how many others have said that to me? I can't imagine. And how many of them still have their voices? Linhua set her cup down gently. I have no ambition to speak above my station. But you understand that you are already above it, the empress replied, her tone almost kind. Favor is louder than proclamation. Linhua said nothing. She let the moment stretch like silk on a loom. The empress continued. You are clever, thoughtful, unattached. These are strengths, but they are also threats. To whom? Linhua asked softly. The empress did not smile. To peace. That word, spoken without inflection, without warning, landed like a blade. Linhua bowed her head slightly. Then allow me to be useful. How? I offer the emperor stillness, Linhua said, as your majesty offers the empire balance. The empress studied her. There was no movement, not even a blink. Then, after a long pause, she nodded once. Then let us keep it so. And just like that, the conversation ended. But something had changed. Linhua returned to her chambers with a new understanding. She had been measured, not scolded, not threatened, weighed, and for now she had been found tolerable. But it was a test, and the first of many. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she lit a single lamp and opened the scrolls Anne had brought her, records of previous consorts, their names, their fates, who had been honored, who had vanished. Some had faded with grace. Others had tried to grasp too far, too fast. The line between success and destruction, she realized, was not drawn by merit, but by perception. You could be wise, you could be beloved, but if you made one misstep, if the wind shifted, if the emperor's gaze lingered elsewhere, you were nothing. So Linhua began to prepare, not for war, not for rebellion, but for permanence. She spoke with the old scholars who tutored the crown prince, learning the history of dynasties long dead. She commissioned ink paintings of quiet gardens, giving them away to minor court officials and their wives. She began to learn which servants were loyal to whom and where to stand during ceremonies, so she was always near, but never before those more senior. She wrote letters, never signed, asked questions, never directly, and she waited for spring, for her moment, for the next turn in the wind, because she understood now more than ever, the emperor's favor was a tide, but influence, true influence, was the stone beneath it, unmoving, unseen, waiting for the sea to calm. By the time spring arrived in full, the palace had transformed. Wisteria cascaded over arched gateways and violet curtains. Carp leapt in shallow ponds, sending ripples across jade-colored water. The courtyards hummed with life again. Servants bustling with fresh duties, nobles arriving from distant provinces bearing tribute, and the rustling swish of gowns marking each step in the ever-shifting dance of court life. The emperor's strength had returned entirely, and with it, his appetite for court gatherings. Music flowed once more through the banquet halls. Poetry contests, garden strolls, even archery displays resumed with all their glittering pageantry. But beneath it all, Linhua felt the tremor of tension, a low, steady vibration hidden beneath silken slippers and porcelain smiles. She had not yet been elevated officially, yet she was treated as one already among the highest. The other consorts did not challenge her directly, but their movements grew sharper, more practiced. The old hierarchy, once so fixed, had begun to shift like thawing ice. The emperor remained attentive, not possessive nor boastful, but present. When she entered a room, he noticed. When she spoke, rarely, he listened, and when she did not, he still looked for her eyes across the crowd, as though their silence was a private conversation no one else could hear. One afternoon, in the garden of whispering pines, he approached her while she sketched quietly beneath a willow. He sat without speaking, watching her brush move over the silk scroll. She had been painting the garden's edge, not its grandeur, but the shadows beneath the rocks, the ripples caught beneath reeds. "You never paint the center," he remarked. She smiled faintly. "The center is what everyone sees." He leaned closer, his voice soft. "But you see the margins. That's where the truth hides." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. "I want you with me during the Festival of Peonies," he said. That was no small request. The Festival of Peonies was more than a celebration of beauty. It was a ritual of display, a moment where the emperor's court was laid bare for all the nobility to witness. The empress would preside, as always. The most favored consorts would be arranged according to rank. To be present at his side publicly meant recognition that no proclamation could undo. Linhua bowed her head, "As your majesty commands." That night, when she returned to her chambers, the implications settled around her like smoke. The emperor had made a choice. Now, so must she. She summoned Anne. "I will need to know how the senior ministers' wives are seated," she said, "and which ones speak most with the empress." Anne gave a nod. "You mean to navigate the field." "I mean to survive it." Preparations for the festival unfolded with theatrical splendor. Servants polished brass lanterns until they glowed like miniature suns. Silk banners were dyed and stitched with motifs of peonies in every hue. Musicians rehearsed day and night, and tailors scurried through the inner quarters like wind-blown leaves. Linhua's dress arrived wrapped in 7 layers of silk. It was ivory, embroidered with a waterfall of cascading petals in varying shades of gold. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. On the morning of the festival, Ruo arranged her hair in a style that lifted and framed her face like the curve of a flower about to bloom. A single hairpin, a gift from the emperor himself, sat like a crown. It bore no jewels, only a carving of a nightingale in flight. When she arrived at the pavilion of eternal spring, the empress was already seated beneath a canopy of scarlet silk, flanked by noblewomen and lesser consorts. As Linhua approached, silence fell. She did not bow too deeply. She did not hurry her step. She walked as though she belonged. When she reached the emperor, he rose. Gasps followed. No one could recall the last time an emperor had stood to greet a consort. He took her hand, not forcefully, not theatrically, just a quiet gesture, acclaiming. "Come," he said, and led her to sit beside him. The poets began their recitations. The dancers moved like petals in wind. Wine was poured, and laughter rose like incense. But Linhua remained still, eyes taking in every movement, every whispered exchange, every twitch of a jealous eye. She saw Concubine Suyin whisper behind her fan to a court lady from the Ministry of Rights. She saw Concubine Lian, demure and distant, her eyes fixed not on the emperor but on the empress. She saw the empress glance toward her only once. That was enough. Later, as the sun dipped low and lanterns replaced daylight, Linhua stepped briefly away to rest in the shade of a magnolia tree. A figure approached, a man, tall, robed in indigo. Minister Zhao, one of the emperor's closest advisors. "My lady," he said with a slight bow, "an exquisite performance." She smiled politely. "The credit belongs to the festival." "Perhaps, but the center of the court has shifted." She did not respond. He stepped closer. "There are those who find comfort in predictability. The rise of something new, even something as delicate as a flower, can be unsettling." She met his gaze, steady. "A flower grows where it is planted, but it does not ask the sun for permission." Zhao inclined his head. "Then let us hope no one seeks to pluck it too soon." When she returned to the emperor's side, he glanced at her and, without speaking, reached once more for her hand. That night, after the festival ended and the nobles retreated to their villas, the palace quieted. Linhua removed her robe, letting it fall like a discarded petal onto the polished floor. She stared into the mirror, at the reflection of a woman no longer hidden in the margins. She was seen now, desired, feared, and still she knew this was only the beginning. Because the brighter the flower, the deeper the shadow it cast. And in that shadow, enemies were already beginning to bloom. In the days following the Festival of Peonies, Linhua noticed a shift, not sudden, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like the change in the air before a summer storm. Servants who once greeted her with warm glances and lowered heads now lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Eunuchs began to pause mid-task when she passed, their silence coated in observation. The atmosphere thickened, not with hostility, but with the subtle tension of anticipation. She had crossed a threshold. With the emperor's gesture, standing before her, leading her to his side, Linhua had been placed beyond mere favor. She had become a symbol, and in the palace, symbols were powerful, but rarely safe. Whispers began, blooming like mildew in the corners of the court. They said she was from a peasant line, that her beauty was unnatural, perhaps even enchanted, that she had poisoned the emperor during his illness, only to nurse him back to health and win his gratitude. Some even said she carried secret knowledge, that she consorted with soothsayers, or that she had studied ancient scripts banned from the inner court. Linhua responded to none of it. She walked with the same calm grace, offered the same quiet bows, and smiled with the same soft serenity that had brought her here. But inside, she was sharpening. One morning, Ruo brought her a sealed letter. The wax bore no crest, only a pressed imprint of a single leaf. It had been delivered in silence, with no sender and no acknowledgement. Linhua opened it slowly, her hands steady. The note was brief. The scholar's daughter wears ink on her fingers and dust on her hem. But she is not alone in the library. There are eyes behind the scrolls. There was no signature, but she knew who had written it. Yin Rui. He had been a junior official in the Court of Archives, a soft-spoken man with ink-stained sleeves and a memory like water. Linhua had met him only once, in passing, when she had visited the Imperial Library weeks ago. She'd asked a quiet question about the lineage of consorts from 2 dynasties ago, and he had answered with precision and a glance that lingered a fraction longer than necessary. She had said nothing, had not spoken to him again. But now, here was his note, a warning, veiled in metaphor. Someone was watching her movements in the library. Linhua burned the letter over a shallow bowl, then poured scented water to drown the ashes. She did not speak of it to Ruo, not even to An. Instead, she returned to the library the next day. She entered alone, as always, choosing a quiet table near the back wall, beneath a panel carved with plum blossoms. She asked for old court records, harmless ones, marriage ceremonies, inheritance disputes. She read slowly, her eyes drifting across the room, catching every reflection in the polished floors, every breath too softly held. And then she saw it. A mirror, tilted ever so slightly behind a lattice screen, meant to catch a different angle, not a trap, an observation. She closed the book, stood, then with absolute calm, walked directly to the head librarian. "May I speak with Scholar Yin Rui?" she asked, voice mild. The librarian blinked. "My lady, he was transferred 2 days ago to the outer provinces." "By whose order?" "I believe it came from the Office of Rituals." Linhua nodded once. "Thank you." She returned to her chambers that evening and found Anne waiting. "I need you to learn something," Linhua said softly. "The Office of Rituals. Who issued the transfer, and where did they send him?" Anne bowed without question. The next evening she returned with an answer. Concubine Leon's cousin, a deputy clerk. The order was written in haste. No official record has been posted. Linhua said nothing for a long time. "She's testing," she said at last, "poking the surface." "She wants to see if you bleed," Anne replied. Linhua nodded slowly. "She must believe I'm still soft." For the next several days she remained entirely invisible. No court appearances, no evening strolls, no visits to the emperor. Let them wonder, let them whisper. And then, precisely 1 week later, she requested a private audience with the Empress Dowager. The old matron received her in the upper chamber, seated beside a wall of wind chimes that tinkled faintly with the breeze. "I see the garden has grown quiet," the Dowager said, voice dry. "Sometimes," Linhua replied, "silence is the best bait." The Dowager lifted a brow. "And what do you fish for?" "Snakes." A pause, then a soft laugh. "You are not gentle, my dear." "I don't have the luxury." The Dowager gestured to the table, where a teapot steamed. "Speak then. What poison have you tasted?" Linhua told her of the mirror, of the reassigned clerk, of the false transfer signed by Leon's kin. She spoke not with outrage, but with calm detail. A report, not a plea. The Dowager listened without interrupting. When Linhua finished, there was a long silence. Finally, she said, "You've done well not to retaliate. I've simply documented." "Good," the Dowager said, "because when retaliation comes, it must never look like yours." Linhua bowed. "I understand." As she stood to leave, the Empress Dowager added, "You are no longer the river girl. Do not forget that." Linhua paused at the doorway. "I remember everything, especially the river." That evening, a quiet change occurred in the records of the inner court. Yin Rui was reassigned, not to the provinces, but to the Imperial Academy, where his talents would be better utilized. 2 days later, Concubine Leon's cousin fell ill. His household reported a sudden fever, though no physicians were summoned. And in the court library, the mirrors were removed. Linhua said nothing. She returned to her studies, her walks, her silences. But when she passed Leon in the corridor one morning, she offered her a smile, polite, distant, and unmistakably sharp. Leon did not return it. She looked away, and Linhua kept walking. Summer arrived quietly, without ceremony. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of ripening fruit and wet stone. Cicadas sang in the courtyards, loud and relentless like a clock the palace could not silence. The fabric of the imperial court grew stickier in the heat. Robes clung to skin, tempers frayed more easily, and whispers turned sharper, thinner, like threads pulled too tight. Linhua moved through it all like water. She had learned to glide instead of walk, to linger instead of press. She spoke only when she had to, and never more than necessary. Those who watched her, too many now to count, could never quite grasp what she wanted. That was by design. Desire, after all, was dangerous currency. Once revealed, it could be weaponized. In early 6th month, a decree was issued. A journey would be made to the summer palace outside the capital. The emperor wished to escape the stifling walls of the main compound, to breathe air touched by pine instead of perfume. It was a tradition, though one rarely exercised with full court attendance. This time, however, he ordered that a select number of consorts accompany him. The empress would lead, of course. Alongside her, Lady Gao of the 2nd rank, Concubine Leon, and unexpected by some but not by all, consort Linhua. The court stirred with the announcement. Linhua heard the rustling behind screens, gets the long exhales after her name was read aloud. She saw the narrowed eyes of court ladies who had once thought her an ornament, nothing more. Now she was not just in the emperor's eye, she was being taken into the countryside, a place of private moments and fewer witnesses. The journey began beneath overcast skies. The procession was grand. banners of red and gold trailing behind the carriages like the tails of dragons. Soldiers lined the roads. Local officials knelt for miles. Musicians played flutes that sounded like birdsong. Inside her curtained carriage, Linhua sat with Ruo beside her and An, riding just behind on a servant's cart. The air was thick with anticipation. Not fear, something else. The feeling one gets when moving closer to the center of a flame. The summer palace was unlike anything Linhua had seen. It was not built of stone and jade, but of dark wood and earth. It nestled into the side of a misty mountain, surrounded by forests and wild lilies. The pavilions curved like the wings of cranes, elegant but modest. Here there were fewer guards, fewer eyes, but the silence was no less sharp. On the first evening, there was a banquet beneath the stars. Long tables set beside the reflecting pool, lanterns floating across its surface like small moons. The emperor sat at the head, dressed in white robes, his hair unbound and caught in the wind like silk thread. Linhua sat 3 places to his left, further than she was accustomed, but well within view. She noticed the empress watching her, just once and briefly. The following day, the emperor invited Linhua to walk with him through the pine grove. She wore no makeup, only a robe the color of river clay, simple and light. Her hair was tied with a single length of unadorned ribbon. He said nothing of her appearance. He never did. But he looked at her often during their walk, his expression unreadable. They spoke little. He pointed out birds he remembered from his youth. She told him of trees she had climbed as a child. When they came upon a stream, he sat on a flat rock and removed his shoes. She did the same. They sat with their feet in the cold water, wordless. At one point he asked, "Do you miss your village?" "I miss how I belong to no one." He turned his head. "You belong to me now." Linhua smiled faintly. "I do not belong. I remain." He was quiet after that. And yet, when they returned to the palace that evening, he ordered a garden be made in the courtyard near her quarters, modeled after the riverbanks of her childhood, with smooth stones and wild reeds. She had said only one sentence, and he had heard all of it. The next day, she was summoned again, not to the emperor, but to the empress. The chamber was smaller than the one in the capital, with no guards and no attendants. "Do you enjoy the mountain air?" the empress asked without rising. "I do, your majesty. It's said the pines here remember everything, the steps of the ancients, the cries of lovers, secrets." Linhua inclined her head. The empress sipped her tea slowly. "Be careful what you leave behind." "I leave nothing behind," Linhua replied softly. "Only footprints. They wash away with the rain. And yet some prints sink deeper than others." There was no threat in her voice, only weariness, or perhaps warning. When Linhua rose to leave, the empress said, almost idly, "Do not walk alone after dusk. There are cliffs." Linhua paused, then nodded. "Thank you for your concern, your majesty." That evening, Linhua sat alone in her new garden. The stones were perfectly chosen, the reeds bent in the wind like old friends. The air smelled of moss and smoke. She had walked beside the emperor beneath pine trees. She had spoken to the empress with bare truths. She had watched the other consorts maneuver for a glance, a smile, a reason to exist. And she had not moved. She didn't need to. She understood something the others did not. Stillness could be louder than ambition. Patience, more dangerous than pride. She dipped her hand into the shallow stream that ran through her garden. The water was cold, clear, and for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to remember. Not the palace, not the court, not the careful lines she walked each day, but her mother's voice, the way she used to hum while washing rice, the sound of that old river running endlessly toward a sea no one ever saw. Rain came on the 4th night at the summer palace. Not the soft drizzle of spring, but a storm, thunderless, windless, steady. It fell in sheets, silvering the walkways and turning the pine needles dark and fragrant. The courtyards emptied, lanterns were taken down, and a hush settled over the compound, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of water on tile. Linhua watched from the covered veranda outside her quarters, wrapped in a shawl of thin wool. The sound of rain reminded her of early mornings in her village, when she would rise before the sun and listen to it fall on the thatched roof, pretending it was the sea. Now the roof was tiled, the shawl was silk-lined, and she had not felt truly alone in many months. Ruo approached quietly and knelt beside her. "Mistress," she whispered. "A servant came. From the kitchens. He brought this." She held out a folded slip of paper. No seal, no name. Linhua took it, unwrapped it carefully. Inside, 2 characters. Tonight, Tea Pavilion. No further instruction. She burned the message immediately, then rose without speaking. The rain had lessened slightly, but the sky remained dark, lit only by brief flickers of lanterns in the distant hallways. The Tea Pavilion sat near the edge of the estate, flanked by 2 bridges and a small lotus pond. It was rarely used, too exposed, too distant from the Emperor's quarters. But tonight, that was the point. She wore a plain robe the color of smoke and did not bring Rua or An. When she arrived, the door was already slightly open. Inside sat Concubine Lian. She looked different here, her hair undone, her robe dark with rain, eyes shining not with powder or cunning, but with something rawer. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said softly. "You summoned me," Linhua replied. "Of course I came." Lian gestured for her to sit. No servants, no guards. "I've seen you," she said, pouring tea. "Not just in court, in the way the Emperor looks at you, the way you move. It's all very precise." Linhua did not speak. Lian continued. "Do you know why I called you here? To say something you can't say with ears nearby." Lian laughed, quiet and bitter. "Once I would have had you removed before you ever touched his sleeve. I had power like that." Linhua didn't flinch. "And now?" Lian met her eyes. "Now I'm tired." The rain softened. "I fought for years," Lian said, her voice low. "I gave him everything. Songs, laughter, poetry. I became what he wanted over and over. And still, he drifted. Not cruelly, just away." "He didn't forget you," Linhua said. "No," Lian agreed. "But memory is not affection." Silence filled the space between them. For a moment it was not the Tea Pavilion, not the Summer Palace, not 2 rivals, just 2 women. "Why me?" Linhua asked at last. "Why now?" Lian set her cup down. "Because I don't want to see you destroyed. And if you keep rising, they will try." "Who?" Lan's lips barely moved. "The ones behind the curtains, the dowagers, the ministers' wives, even the Empress. She will not strike first, but she will allow the blow." Linhua looked into her cup. The tea had gone cold. "And you?" "I won't help them," Lian said. "Not anymore." "Because you pity me?" "No," she said, and for once there was no venom. "Because I admire you." The admission was unexpected and disarming. Then Lan leaned forward slightly. "But you need to understand. Admiration is not friendship. We are not allies. If you threaten what little I have left, I will still defend it." Linhua nodded. "I wouldn't expect otherwise." A gust of wind pushed the door open farther, and the rain returned, louder now. Lian stood. "This is the last time we will speak like this." "I know." Lian stepped into the rain without hesitation. Her figure dissolved into the night, and Linhua sat alone, tea cooling in her hands. She returned to her chambers before dawn. The garden stones were slick, the courtyard silent. Rua had waited by the door, her eyes filled with unspoken worry, but said nothing as she wrapped Linhua's wet robe in towels and led her inside. Later that morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Linhua received an unexpected summons, not from the Emperor, but from the Master of Ceremonies. A private audience was to be held in the Pavilion of Heavenly Light. The Emperor would attend, and so would all 4 senior consorts, no reason given, no occasion, and watched her dress with attention she tried to hide. "It's rare," she said quietly, "for the Emperor to gather you all." "I know," Linhua said. She chose her robes carefully, light blue silk with pale embroidery, nearly invisible unless seen in the right light, understated, unthreatening. When she arrived, the 3 others were already seated. The Empress, serene and unreadable. Lady Gao, all powdered smiles and glances that flickered like fish beneath ice. And Lion, composed, distant, her expression as still as painted porcelain. The Emperor arrived last. He looked between them with a gaze that carried neither warmth nor cold, simply presence. Then he spoke. "We are no longer in the city. There are no walls here, no echoes, only trees. I wanted to see you without your guards, without ceremony." No one replied. He continued. "The court is watching. The outer ministers wonder who I will name." Silence. Linhua understood then. This was the beginning of succession, not for the throne, but for the heart of the harem. The Emperor looked directly at her. "I know who walks beside me without noise." Then to the others, "And I know who waits to be seen." Stillness reigned. He rose. "You may go." They all bowed, and as Linhua stood, something in the Empress's expression shifted. Not defeat, but recognition. A line had been drawn, and everyone saw where Linhua stood. The days after the gathering in the pavilion of heavenly light felt strangely weightless, as though time had paused in the stillness of that unspoken declaration. The emperor had not named her. He had not crowned her with title or ribbon, but with a single look he had revealed the direction of his heart, and that was more dangerous than any proclamation. Linhua returned to her chambers and found them undisturbed. No offerings, no sudden gifts, but the guards posted outside stood straighter, and the servant girls bowed lower. Even the eunuch assigned to sweep her walkways began using water infused with orchid petals, a detail reserved only for the empress and her direct lineage. Power moved like shadow in the palace. It never arrived with trumpets. It arrived in silence, carried by posture, by deference, by what was no longer spoken aloud. But Linhua knew better than to let the silence comfort her. The summer palace may have looked tranquil from the outside, pine boughs brushing rooftops, koi rippling under bridges, but it was no less a battlefield. The danger here was quieter. There were no court edicts, no public accusations, only proximity, only what could be arranged in the dark. On the 5th day after the gathering, she awoke with a strange feeling in her chest. Not fear, not pain, but a tightness, a sense that something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Ruo brought her morning tea as always, placing it on the lacquered tray with a small bowl of dried apricots. Linhua sipped once, twice, then paused. "Did you taste this before serving it?" she asked, setting the cup down. Ruo paled. "I didn't. I wasn't asked to." Linhua nodded. "Fetch Anne." And arrived moments later, her eyes sharp from the threshold. She took one look at the untouched apricots, the half-empty cup, and turned on her heel without a word. Within the hour, the tea was tested. It wasn't poison, not in the traditional sense. It was something subtler, a plant compound known to bring confusion, tremors, not enough to kill, but enough to humiliate, to make one appear unstable, hysterical, unfit. Linhua did not speak for a long time after the results were confirmed. She sat in her chair, looking out at the garden, her hands folded in her lap. Someone had dared, not to end her, but to undo her, and returned at dusk after making quiet inquiries among the kitchen servants. The leaves were steeped separately, she said. The pot was passed through the northern corridor. The Empress's steward was seen there this morning. Linhua absorbed this without blinking. Not Leon. No. She wouldn't risk it, and hesitated. The Empress didn't do it herself either. It's too soon, too obvious. Linhua nodded. A test, she murmured. Yes. To see how I would react. And knelt beside her, voice low. What will you do? Linhua's eyes drifted toward the courtyard, where a nightingale hopped between stones, head tilted. Nothing, and blinked. Nothing? Linhua smiled, just barely. Nothing they'll see. That night, she wrote a letter. No seal, no name. She sent it through a eunuch whose loyalty she had secured months earlier with a quiet act of mercy, one that cost her nothing but had bought her silence ever since. The letter traveled to a minor scribe in the Ministry of Rights. Not a high-ranking man, just one with access. 3 days later, a rumor began to circulate in the outer court. It was quiet, a whisper, about a steward in the Empress's household who had ties to a merchant recently arrested for smuggling rare herbs, the kind of herbs that might be used to influence the clarity of the mind. Nothing was said officially, no charges were made, but within the week that steward was quietly replaced. No announcement, no apology, only absence. The Empress never addressed it, but Linhua noticed that during the next court assembly, the Empress looked at her only once, and then looked away. It was a message. You saw, you understood, and Linhua's silence had spoken louder than any retaliation. Later that evening, the Emperor summoned her. No reason given, no fanfare. She entered his chamber to find him seated beside an open window, a silk fan resting against his knee. The scent of sandalwood drifted in the air. "You've been quiet," he said without turning. "I was watching." "And what did you see?" "Movement," she said, "the kind that hides in still water." He smiled, eyes still on the horizon. "You remind me of my mother. She once told me that if you wait long enough, even lies will bloom into flowers, and then you can see their color." "I prefer to know before they bloom," Linhua replied. At that, he turned to her. For a long time, he simply looked. Then he said, "I'm naming a new noble consort, after we return to the capital." She inhaled softly, but did not speak. "It will cause unrest," he continued, "but it's time." He rose, crossed the floor to her and placed one hand against her cheek. Be ready. That night, as the moon cast silver light across the courtyard tiles, Linhua sat awake. She knew the weight of what was coming. A new title, a new station, one step from the highest throne a woman could sit upon without a crown. But she also knew the cost. This was the point of no return. From here, there would be no retreat, no illusion of insignificance. Every gesture, look, every word she uttered would become doctrine to someone and a threat to someone else. The court would not forgive her rise, and neither would it forget. But Linhua did not fear memory. She had been born of it, molded by it, and now she would shape it. The return to the capital began beneath a red sun. It rose low on the horizon, burning through the mist like an omen. Servants moved like ants along the walkways, loading carts, folding robes, wrapping scrolls. The emperor's retinue, reduced for the summer, swelled again in preparation for re-entry into the center of power. Linhua stood beneath the awning of her courtyard, wrapped in a travel robe the color of wet stone. Her hair was bound in a simple knot, adorned with a single hairpin of ivory carved in the shape of a crane mid-flight. Ruo checked the lacquered trunks one last time, careful with the embroidered robes, and stood behind them, arms folded, silent as always. But Linhua's eyes were not on the servants or the preparations. She was watching the sky. A red sun meant change. That was what the village elders used to say. Red for blood, red for fire, red for fortune, but always red for movement. By midday, the procession had begun. Horses with gold-braided reins, guards in ceremonial armor, palanquins bearing the emperor, the empress, and the consorts in silent, measured rhythm. The journey took 3 days. Each night they stayed in smaller royal residences nestled along the road. During the day, the nobles and ministers rode in separate lines behind, their laughter distant, their eyes never far from the emperor's carriage. It was a ritual not just of travel, but of visibility, of knowing who sat where, who spoke when, who remained silent. Linhua did not see the emperor during the journey, not directly, but each evening a dish she preferred was placed among the banquet offerings. A particular poem she had once recited was performed by a traveling troupe. The incense burned in her quarters was no longer cedar but plum blossom, subtle threads woven quietly. He was reminding her and reminding the others. On the final morning, the towers of the main palace appeared on the horizon like fingers reaching through the clouds. Golden roofs shimmered in the heat. Banners flapped from stone walls. The gates stood open, but waiting. Always waiting. When her palanquin passed beneath the first arch, Linhua felt a chill. Not from cold, but from memory. The last time she had entered these gates, she had been a number, a name inked on a scroll, a girl with oiled hair and trembling hands. Now she returned as something else entirely, the noble consort-to-be. The announcement did not come immediately. There was protocol. The Court of Rights required petition. The Grand Council must review. The astrologers consulted charts. It was all formality. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time, but time in the palace was never neutral. 2 days after their return, a fire broke out in the southern cloisters. It was small, contained, no injuries. But the building affected housed ceremonial garments and seasonal fabrics, among them the robes prepared for Linhua's elevation. The flames were brief. The message was not. It was a warning. No one took credit, of course. The investigation found nothing. A lantern left too close to drying silks, a gust of wind through an open screen. Accidents, they said. But Linhua knew better. She stood over the ashes the next morning, her hands clasped before her. The tailor knelt beside her, shaking, apologizing repeatedly. She said nothing. She simply stepped away and returned to her chambers. There she requested her personal brush set and a scroll of unmarked silk, and she began to write. She wrote a poem, not addressed to anyone, not signed, just 14 lines, delicate and simple. A robe once sewn may burn in hours, but ash feeds the root of the pine. Let the wind carry what it must. The tree does not ask who tried to cut it. She left it at the incense altar in the central temple, where all might see. By evening, it had been read by at least 20. By morning, it had been copied into 6 personal diaries. And by nightfall, it had reached the emperor's study. The next day, a new robe arrived, not from the court tailor, from the imperial wardrobe itself. It was pale gold, threaded with silver dragons, a design last worn by the former noble consort 2 reigns prior. reserved only for those with imperial favor of the highest order. With it came a single orchid, freshly plucked, resting in a sealed ivory box. No note, no signature, but Linhua needed none. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the bells rang the hour of the rat, she stepped into the Hall of Blessings for a private audience. The emperor sat beneath the painted canopy alone. He rose when she entered, and for a moment, there was no distance between them. No formality, just breath, just gaze. You've been tested, he said softly. Linhua bowed. I will be tested again. He reached out, his fingers brushing her sleeve. Do you still want this? She looked at him, looked past the fine robe, the carved jade throne, the ceilings painted with phoenixes, and she said, I never wanted it. A pause. I earned it. He smiled, and he nodded. The ceremony was set for the following month after the mid-autumn rites. The Court of Rites began their preparations anew. New silks were chosen, blessings recited, a name drafted, noble consort Linhua. She returned to her quarters that night beneath a sky that held no stars, only clouds. But she did not look up. She looked forward. She had stepped into the storm and found her footing. Now she would begin to climb. The moon waxed full. Mid-autumn approached with a quiet solemnity, the kind that cloaked the palace in ritual and remembrance. Every surface seemed to shimmer under the weight of tradition. Courtyards were swept twice daily. Lanterns of rabbit and plum shapes were strung from every eave. Sweet lotus cakes arrived in ornate boxes bound in golden thread. The empress presided over rehearsals for the formal rites, while scholars recited ancient verses praising the balance of yin and yang. But beneath the festive lacquer, the court braced itself. They were not preparing merely for celebration, but for ascension. Linhua's ascension. Her elevation to noble consort would be marked alongside the mid-autumn ceremony, a poetic symmetry. The second highest woman of the inner court, crowned beneath the brightest moon. It was a gesture of benevolence, of renewal, of imperial harmony. But Linhua understood the deeper meaning. It was a declaration, a woman of no noble house, no family ties, no faction, chosen, and the palace would not let it go unchallenged. The days leading to the ceremony became a study in subtle resistance. The robe makers delayed fittings, citing frayed seams and missing dyes. The ceremonial musicians protested the chosen melodies, calling them unfavorable for balance. The lead court historian hesitated over the phrasing of the official record. Should it include her origin? Her lack of pedigree? At first, Linhua said nothing. She simply watched. But on the fourth morning, she summoned the chief of the inner archives, a man known for his impeccable memory and absolute neutrality. She greeted him with tea and 3 requests. First, that the robes be embroidered not with dragons but with mountain peaks. Second, that the musicians perform The Reeds Return, an old village tune once played by wandering flutists, rarely heard in court. Third, that her lineage be stated plainly, born of river village stock, chosen through merit, confirmed by favor, and elevated by decree. The archivist raised a brow. These are humble choices, my lady, unusual. That is the point, Linhua replied. Let them write it as it is. He bowed low. Then it will be remembered. Word of her choices spread quickly. Some called them brilliant, others called them foolish, but all agreed on one thing: they could not be ignored. That evening a gift arrived at her chambers. It was wrapped in silk dyed the color of deep wine, sealed with red wax bearing no crest. Inside a single inkstone, smooth, polished, hollowed just slightly. Beneath it, a folded note. The stone that yields to water does not break, but the hand that holds it must never tremble. There was no name, but she knew. Lin, a message, perhaps. A warning, perhaps something else. Neither enemy nor friend, a witness. Linhua kept the stone. She placed it on her writing table, beside the small bronze mirror she never used. The day of the ceremony arrived under a sky so clear it felt painted. Before dawn, Ruo dressed her in the robe of mountain peaks, threaded with grays and silvers, accented by only a hint of gold at the hem. A wide belt of dark blue bound her waist. Her hair was styled simply, pinned with one long ornament of lacquered wood and pearl. She wore no cosmetics save for a touch of color on her lips. No jewels, no fragrance. When she stepped into the corridor, servants gasped in silence. She looked less like a jewel and more like a relic unearthed, ancient, clean, and untouched by artifice. The procession moved slowly toward the Moon Terrace, a high platform overlooking the Imperial Gardens, where the formal rites would be performed. The empress led, regal and austere in full ceremonial robes. The emperor followed, clad in white and silver. Behind him, the court of ministers, the dowagers, the consorts, the daughters of the noble families, all watching. And then Linhua. She walked without music, her steps made no sound. When she reached the terrace, she knelt before the emperor, who stood with the scroll in his hands. He read the words himself. Not a herald, not a minister. I, the Son of Heaven, by mandate of the ancestors, and in accordance with the harmony of the realms, named Linhua, born without house, raised without title, chosen through service, as noble consort of the inner court. The wind stirred. The clouds shifted just slightly, and the full moon rose behind him, casting silver across her bowed head. She did not cry. She did not smile. She bowed lower. When the rite ended, the crowd dispersed in measured waves, rippling out from the terrace like ink dropped into still water. But Linhua remained kneeling even after the emperor turned away, and it was the empress, surprisingly, who lingered beside her. She looked down, eyes unreadable. You understand, she said, voice barely more than breath, what this means now? Linhua looked up slowly. Yes. The empress gave a single nod, then walked away. No congratulations, no welcome, only acknowledgement. That night, Linhua sat alone in her chamber, half robe folded beside her, the inkstone on the table catching the moonlight. She was no longer rising. She had arrived. But power, she knew, was not a place. It was a balance. And from here onward, she would need to master the art of holding still. Autumn deepened, and with it came the soft rustle of fallen leaves, gathering in corners like forgotten letters. The air in the palace turned crisp, carrying with it the scent of chrysanthemum and ink. Fires were lit earlier each evening, warming the marbled halls that, despite their grandeur, seemed colder now. Noble consort Linhua no longer walked unseen. She no longer passed through corridors as a shadow, no longer waited for doors to open. They opened before her. Her name was announced in every hall, her seat reserved at every banquet. Servants scrambled at the sound of her voice. The other consorts, once higher, once distant, lowered their heads when she entered. It was not just position, it was recognition, and with it came isolation. The emperor's favor did not fade after the ceremony. On the contrary, it became more constant. He dined with her twice weekly, asked for her presence during court poetry readings, invited her to observe state rituals, though always from a careful distance, where her eyes could see, but her voice could not yet advise. She understood the nuance. He was drawing her closer, but not yet allowing her to speak in public matters. Not yet. Still, her presence unsettled many, especially the ministers who had hoped for a noble consort with ties, someone they could influence, someone from a family who could be praised or punished. But Linhua had no such strings. She had no father among the officials, no brothers in the army, no cousins in the treasury, and that made her untouchable, or so some believed. On the 10th day of the 9th month, the first sign of fracture arrived. It came in the form of a letter, unmarked, slipped between the folds of a prayer scroll delivered to her meditation room. Its contents were brief. He has a son. She read the sentence 3 times. It was not accusation, not confession. A fact placed before her like a stone in the path. She folded the note, set it aflame in the incense brazier, and remained silent. Later that night, Anne approached quietly as Linhua sat in her study, poring over a map of palace halls and servant rotations. There is something, Anne said, you should know. Linhua looked up. The boy is 6. He was raised quietly in the western compound. His mother, one of the lesser attendants, died during childbirth. He was acknowledged only in writing. No ceremony, no name spoken aloud, but the blood is confirmed. Linhua closed her eyes. A child, a son, hidden from the court, protected or concealed, and continued, the boy is not kept in squalor. He is guarded, educated. A tutor visits daily, but no one speaks of him. Not even the empress? Linhua asked. No, said Anne, especially not the empress. Linhua sat in silence for a long time, staring at the flickering candle. Then she whispered, they will want to use him, and didn't ask who. They both knew. A son born of a forgotten woman, unnamed, unclaimed. He was a blank page. And for those who feared Linhua's influence, the boy was a quill, sharp and waiting. That night, Linhua requested a book of Imperial family lineages. She pored through the names of princes, the ceremonial titles, the recorded births and deaths of minor branches. The boy's name was nowhere to be found. He had no presence. which meant he could be shaped into anything. Days passed. No one spoke of the boy. No new messages arrived. But the silence around her had changed. At court banquets, she noticed certain ministers watching her more intently. She caught the Empress speaking to Lady Gao in tones more clipped than usual. Even the Emperor seemed heavier, his smiles less frequent, his silences longer. Then one afternoon she was summoned, not by the Emperor, not by the Empress, but by Dowager Consort Xian. It was a name not often spoken aloud. A widow of the late Emperor, Xian had long withdrawn from the central court, retreating into a life of prayer and solitude in the northern wing. Few saw her. Fewer still were summoned. Linhua obeyed immediately. The northern wing was colder than the rest of the palace, sparsely adorned, heavy with the scent of aged cedar and camphor wood. The chamber where the Dowager Consort waited was dim, its only light a slant of sun through a carved lattice. Shan sat alone on a low cushion, robed in dark violet. Her hair was silver, bound tightly behind her head. Her eyes, though faded with age, were piercing. She gestured without rising. "Sit." Linhua did. They did not speak for several moments. Then the Dowager Consort said, "You remind me of someone." Linhua waited. Her name was Mei. She rose like you, from nothing, and for a time she held the Emperor's world in her hands. Linhua spoke carefully. "What became of her?" "She mistook her influence for permanence," Shan said. "She believed she was beloved." "And she wasn't?" "She was feared, admired, perhaps even respected. But love is a fragile illusion in the hands of powerful men." Linhua held the older woman's gaze. "Why call me here?" Shan leaned forward, her voice low. "There is a child. Do you know?" "I've heard. He is the Emperor's blood." "Yes. And what will you do with that knowledge?" Linhua answered without pause. "Protect him." The Dowager Consort narrowed her eyes. "Even if he stands in your way?" Linhua said nothing. Then she asked, "Do you believe power must be taken from others?" Shan stared for a long time, then smiled faintly. "You're wiser than Mei." When Linhua rose to leave, the Dowager Consort spoke again. "You may not have family here, child, but if you walk carefully, you may yet create one." Linhua bowed low, and when she returned to her chambers, she wrote a single line in her private scroll. "He must remain hidden until the storm forgets his name." She folded it, locked it away, and began to build the quiet scaffolding of protection, not for herself, not yet, but for the boy who bore the blood of an emperor and the weight of a crown he did not ask to wear. As the leaves turned gold and crimson, the palace prepared for the cold dew festival, an observance not of splendor, but of refinement. It marked the waning of warmth, a celebration of the stillness before winter's arrival. Chrysanthemum petals were floated in wine, calligraphy scrolls were unfurled beside shallow ponds, and the air smelled faintly of aged tea and fallen pine needles. It was during this time of restraint and contemplation that Linhua began to act. Quietly, invisibly. She understood, now more than ever, that visibility was no longer her ally. As noble consort, every step she took left a trail of echoes. So she stopped leaving steps. She moved through others, spoke through silences, and in doing so, she reached where no title could go. She began with the boy. His name, she discovered through Anne's carefully planted questions, was Yun. It was a quiet name, simple, unrecorded, but it existed. A name only the tutors and one elderly nurse used. He was kept in a secluded annex near the Hall of Painted Fans, far from the inner court, surrounded by attendants loyal to no one. Most had served under the Empress long ago, but had since been scattered to quiet posts. They posed no threat, but neither were they shields. Linhua did not visit him. That would be dangerous, too direct. Instead, she arranged for a scroll, a gift sent under the name of a visiting monk from the northern provinces, a volume of parables, fables about animals and mountains with drawings done in soft charcoal ink. Hidden in its binding was a message. Speak little. Listen always. There are more eyes on you than you will ever see. She never knew if the boy read it. But 3 days later, the tutor assigned to him resigned abruptly, citing family illness. His replacement was one of Linhua's recommendations, presented months ago, long before the elevation. A scholar from the outer provinces. Gentle, brilliant, loyal to no court faction, a seed planted early, and now it had grown. At court, her presence remained measured. She made no demands. She corrected no one. She took her place beside the Empress during ceremonies, always one step behind, her hands folded, her head slightly bowed. But her silence had changed. It had weight now, and the Empress knew it. One afternoon, while observing a poetry recitation in the Garden of Twin Pines, the Empress leaned toward her. "Tell me," she said softly, "do you write anymore?" Linhua smiled politely. "Only when I have something to remember." "Not to be remembered?" "No, that's what others do." The Empress studied her for a moment. "And yet, they will remember you." "That isn't my doing." "No," the Empress said, voice like silk drawn across stone. "It's your survival." That evening, Linhua returned to her chambers and found a package resting on the table, unmarked. Inside, a comb, simple, wooden, painted with lacquered chrysanthemums, the kind given to girls when they first bled, when they first stepped into womanhood. It was not an insult. It was a statement. "You are still becoming." She held it in her hands for a long time. Then she placed it on her vanity beside her finest hairpin, a reminder. The next morning, Ruo returned from the inner kitchens with strange news. Concubine Suyin had collapsed in the garden during her morning tea. A sudden fainting. No illness diagnosed. She had been moved to the western quarters and was not accepting visitors. Linhua closed her eyes briefly. Suyin had been quiet for months. After the summer palace, she had withdrawn from most court events, offering only smiles and occasional verses at banquets, but she had not disappeared. Not entirely. A fainting, without warning, in full view. It was not a message for Linhua. It was a message for the Emperor. "I am still here." Linhua did not react. Instead, she began to write again. Poems, yes, but also short histories, fictions clothed in the robes of truth. One told of a scholar who saved a prince by pretending to be mad. Another of a woman who tamed a tiger, not with strength, but with stillness. She gave them to the scribes. Let them circulate among the palace readers. Let the court ladies whisper their meanings. Let the metaphors speak louder than proclamations. And then a change. The Emperor summoned her, not for court, not for ceremony, but to the private chamber behind the library, a place where he rarely met anyone. When she arrived, he stood near the window watching the sky. "It will snow soon," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty." "I think of you when the seasons change." She approached slowly. "Why?" "Because you never change with them." She tilted her head. "Is that a flaw?" "No," he said. "It's a kind of constancy I didn't know I needed." He turned to face her. "They are speaking of succession." Linhua's breath did not catch. Her pulse did not rise. "They always do," she replied. This time, louder. She met his gaze. "Will you silence them?" He stepped closer. "No, I want to listen." She understood. He was not asking for loyalty. He was offering trust, and with it a question deeper than any spoken aloud. "If I name you mother of the future emperor, will you protect the crown or yourself?" She did not answer. Instead, she bowed. And in that bow was every answer he needed. That night, for the first time, she dreamed of the child. Not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a boy, running barefoot along the river, chasing cranes into the mist. The first snow arrived on the last night of the 10th month. It came without warning, falling quietly under a moonless sky. By morning, the palace was wrapped in white, its golden roofs dulled beneath the blanket of frost. Gardens turned to sculptures, ponds to polished glass, and the cypress trees bowed beneath the weight of silence. In the cold, the court moved slower. Breath clouded in the halls. Servants wrapped their hands in cloth, their voices muffled under scarves. Even the ministers spoke more softly, as if afraid of breaking the hush that winter had draped across the imperial city. But Linhua felt sharper than ever. The frost did not dull her, it clarified her. In its stillness, she found vision. In the cold, she felt fire. She had not seen the emperor since their conversation behind the library, but the implications of his words had rippled outward like ink in water. Succession. The word had not been spoken aloud in court. There was no heir, no formal candidate, but the absence of a name was a vacuum, and vacuums drew whispers. Some nobles called for the empress to produce a suitable adoption from her clan. Others urged consideration of the emperor's distant nephews. A few brave voices asked about consort Linhua, but always indirectly through metaphors or parables in morning discourse. The emperor listened, but he said nothing. Then one evening a chessboard appeared in Linhua's study. No note, just the board, a lacquered grid with 2 jade pieces placed in the center, the black general and the white scholar. She understood, a challenge, an invitation, or a warning. That same night she summoned An and Ruo. We must know which ministers oppose any child not born of the Empress, she said. Not openly, privately, their wives, their stewards, their second sons. And nodded once. How far do you wish to reach, as far as necessary? Over the next weeks, she built a map, not of roads or names, but of sympathies. She traced the threads of who dined with whom, who lent servants during ceremonies, who offered what gifts during the harvest. She charted influence not by rank, but by warmth. And slowly, a pattern emerged. 4 ministers were loyal to the Empress in name, but not in heart. 3 others favored the old line, ancient clans with little actual sway, but much nostalgia. And 5 had already turned their attention toward the western compound, toward the boy. He had not been seen, not once since the rumors began, but that only made him more powerful, a ghost with a crown. Linhua knew the boy's danger did not lie in who he was, but in what others could make of him. He had no voice, no protector, no mother, unless she stepped forward. But to do so would be to reveal everything, to end her quiet influence and begin a battle no longer fought in silence. She wasn't ready, not yet. So she turned again to something smaller, quieter. She requested to visit the archives. It was not unusual. As noble consort, she had access. She had long been known to read, but this time she asked for a very specific text, a copy of the Treatise on Maternal Virtue, written 3 reigns ago, a record of the qualities deemed necessary in the mother of a future sovereign. The request was noted, quietly, deliberately. The next day she received a visitor, not a eunuch, not a servant, but Lady Yan, wife of Minister Yan Rui, a senior figure in the Ministry of Rites, an elegant woman with eyes like river stones, still and full of hidden depth. They took tea beneath the painted screen in Linhua's chamber, chrysanthemum brew, lightly spiced. I hear, said Lady Yan, smiling, that you have an interest in Imperial traditions. Only in what still breathes inside them, Linhua replied. Lady Yan studied her for a long moment, then said, My husband says the Emperor is listening to you. He listens to the wind, not the speaker. Still, not all whispers pass his ears. They drank in silence. Then Linhua asked, Do you believe the crown should belong to blood or to wisdom? Lady Yan smiled faintly. I believe the crown belongs to survival. That night, Linhua stood by her window as the snow fell again. She did not think of robes or titles. She thought of Yun. Where was he in this moment? Was he asleep, dreaming, cold? Did he know he was being spoken of in rooms he had never entered? Did he know how many eyes were on him? She closed her eyes, and then without ceremony, without witnesses, she made a decision. Not to fight for him yet, not to name him, not to pull him into the fire, but to begin preparing the place where his name could someday be spoken safely. She called Ruo. Send a gift, she said, to the western compound. No card, no name. What should I send? Linhua looked out at the snow, a kite, red silk, light enough for winter wind. Ruo hesitated. Will they understand? They will, Linhua said, and she thought as she watched the first kite-shaped shadow flit across the falling snow, let them wonder who protects him. Let them wonder where he belongs. And when the time comes, let them realize it was never about blood. It was about who had already chosen him. The kite was seen, not by the boy. Linhua had not expected that, but by those who watched him. Servants, stewards, couriers pretending not to notice the bundle of red silk left at the gate of the western compound. It was hung on a pine branch the next morning, fluttering against the gray-white sky like a wound that refused to close. By evening, the rumors had shifted, not spoken, not even whispered, but felt. Someone was watching the child. Someone cared. That someone had no name, no proclamation. Only the wind and a kite. And in the palace, where names were currency and silence was often more dangerous than speech, such a gesture was louder than thunder. Linhua said nothing. She did not visit the boy. She did not speak his name aloud. But she noticed over the coming days the subtle changes. Servants from the western compound began to bow deeper when they passed her. One of the physicians, an old man with trembling hands, sent a wrapped parcel to her chamber. Inside was a small clay charm shaped like a lion cub. No note, only a trace of mugwort tucked inside. Protection, a symbol known among old healers, for children, for sons. And then something stranger. The Empress sent her a gift. It arrived during the hour of the snake, borne by 2 court ladies and accompanied by a steward with impeccable manners. A folded robe of pale blue silk, winter weight. embroidered with subtle reeds bending in the wind. Linhua accepted it with a serene smile. A gift for the season, the steward said, bowing low. She offered only one reply. Tell Her Majesty I bend, but do not break. The steward flinched just slightly, then bowed again and departed. Ruo looked at the robe long after the doors closed behind them. Do you think it's poisoned? No, Linhua said. It's worse than that. What is it then? A question. It was a probe, offered not in hostility, but in curiosity. An invitation to declare herself, to show her hand. But Linhua would not. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to the festival approaching. The Winter Harmony Rites, a ceremony older than any living member of court, performed once every 5 years, symbolizing balance between heaven and earth, ruler and people, emperor and consort. Tradition dictated that the empress stand alone at the emperor's side, but the emperor broke tradition. A decree was issued 3 days before the festival. Noble consort Linhua would accompany the empress to the altar of frost. The court did not gasp, it held its breath. Linhua said nothing. She accepted the robe, accepted the role. But inside she understood the weight of what had been done. This was not an honor, it was a dividing line. When she arrived on the day of the rites, the sky was blanketed in mist. Snow lay thick on the roofs, pristine and untouched. The altar of frost, a circular dais of white marble surrounded by cypress trees, glowed beneath a canopy of silk. The empress stood in her full regalia, flanked by attendants in red and gold. Linhua wore silver, no jewels, no veil, only the robe of bending reeds which she had chosen deliberately for this moment, to show that she had received the empress's gift and returned it. They walked side by side toward the altar. The emperor waited beneath the canopy, robes layered with white and black, a symbol of unity. His gaze moved between them, unreadable. The ceremony began. Incense was lit, prayers chanted, and as the final verse was spoken, the empress and Linhua knelt before the frost altar and placed their hands on the sacred stone. Together, no words passed between them, but the gesture said everything. We are not allies, but we are bound. That evening, the palace was silent. Snow fell again. Ruo lit the lamps in Linhua's chamber, while Anne brought a report, quiet, factual. The empress had remained in her quarters. No new orders, no messages. But in the outer court, 2 ministers had sent letters of tribute to Linhua's household. One had included a rare inkstone from the southern provinces. The other, a scroll of ancestral proverbs once given only to dowagers. Both knew what the ceremony had meant, and so did she. Later, alone, Linhua stood in her garden. The pines were heavy with snow. The wind had stilled. She looked at the sky. There were no stars, but there was the boy. Not in body, but in the space between her breath and the cold. She felt him there, waiting, like a seed buried deep beneath frost. And she thought, let them believe I am only a consort. Let them write poems and draw maps and whisper of power. I will be the soil, and he will rise. The year turned, and with it came the great frost. For weeks, the sun barely rose. Light hovered low and gray like a breath held too long. The rivers outside the city froze solid. Pine branches cracked under their own weight. Inside the palace, brazier smoke thickened the corridors, and courtiers wrapped themselves in layers, speaking only when necessary. This was the season when the court grew brittle. Small tensions, long ignored, would splinter in the silence. The weight of waiting wore down even the most disciplined minds. And Linhua now more than ever understood that time itself was a blade, slow but precise. Her chamber grew quieter. Fewer visitors, no banquets. The emperor, often confined to his study in the West Wing, sent word but not presence. Each message brief, observing, still. And Yua felt no loneliness. She was watching. Beneath the frost, the roots were shifting. On the 3rd day of the 1st month, a courier arrived at her chamber with a sealed package. An unassuming wooden box bound with silk cord the color of dried rose petals. The note bore no name, only 3 words. His voice strengthens. Linhua said nothing as she read it. Ruo, kneeling beside her, did not ask. She had grown used to these messages, unclaimed, anonymous, yet each woven into the pattern of something far larger. She handed the box to An, who opened it carefully. Inside, a slate tablet etched with characters in a child's hand. A river listens before it speaks, a proverb, or a lesson, or perhaps a code. Linhua felt her fingers tighten just slightly over the carved wood. So Yun was speaking now, not with the babble of a forgotten child, but with meaning, with memory. Someone had taught him more than reading. Someone had taught him patience. She turned to Anne. We protect the tutor, quietly, and nodded. Already done. Linhua stood. The wind is changing. Elsewhere in the palace, other movements began. The Empress called for a gathering of consorts, a rare midwinter assembly, justified on the pretext of reviewing ceremonial duties for the upcoming Lantern Festival. But Linhua knew better. This was not about lanterns. It was about balance. The Empress had tolerated Linhua's rise. She had endured the elevation. She had even shared the altar during the frost rites. But tolerance was not submission. The court was watching, and the Empress knew she must reassert her position or risk losing what remained of her authority. The gathering took place in the Hall of Morning Dew, a high chamber with golden beams and floor cushions embroidered with the emblems of rank. Incense drifted upward in slow coils. The consorts were seated according to order. Linhua, by protocol, should have taken the second seat after the Empress. Instead, the Empress had requested no formality and placed her among the others. A statement. Linhua obeyed without pause. She sat quietly among them, her robe a muted gray-green, her hair unadorned save for a pin of carved agate, no dragons, no phoenixes. The other women watched her as one might watch an unfamiliar animal, curious, cautious, waiting for movement. The Empress addressed the assembly with practiced ease. She spoke of ceremony, of the importance of harmony, of respecting one's place. Her eyes, however, flickered toward Linhua only once. It was not a glance, it was a challenge, and Linhua met it with stillness. She spoke only once during the meeting, when asked to offer a suggestion for the Lantern Festival's central display. Her reply was gentle, measured. A river of lights, she said, unbroken, flowing from the Gate of Harmony to the inner garden. One line, no colors, only white, like memory on water. There was silence, then a few murmurs of approval. Even the Empress inclined her head. Subtle, symbolic, unthreatening, but Linhua knew what the display would mean. One line, unbroken. The current could not be split. Later that evening, she received an unexpected visitor, Concubine Leon. She had not spoken to Leon in months, not since their midnight meeting at the tea pavilion. Lan had withdrawn from court life even further. Rumors whispered of illness, of spiritual retreat. Yet here she stood at Linhua's threshold, veiled in soft wool and eyes rimmed with fatigue. Linhua welcomed her without ceremony. They sat across from one another, a single brazier between them, warming their hands. "You've become very quiet," Linhua said. "I'm learning to listen," Leon replied. Linhua studied her face. "You were always listening." Lion looked away. "Not well enough." There was a pause, then Leon asked, "Does he know about the boy?" Linhua was silent. "Do you intend to tell him?" Leon pressed, her voice low. "When the time is right." "Who decides that? I do." Leon didn't smile, but her voice softened. "Then you'd better choose well." She stood, her figure tall but lean now, like a reed in frost. "Not all storms come with wind," she said. "Some come when the snow begins to melt." And she left. That night, Linhua dreamt again, but not of the boy, not of the court. She dreamt of the river, dark, endless, winding between hills. She stood on its bank, barefoot, her reflection broken by ripples died from behind her a voice, not the Emperor's, not a child's, her own. "What are you building, Linhua?" She did not answer, but in the dream her hands were full of stones, smooth, flat, cold, and she was laying them, one by one, across the water. By the second month, the snow had begun to recede. Not quickly, not obviously, but the signs were there for those who knew where to look. A trickle beneath the stone bridges, the early cry of a bird that had been silent for months, buds forming on branches that still looked dead, and within the palace too, something thawed. The Emperor emerged from the solitude of his winter study. He resumed appearances at council, reopened the southern court for petitions, took meals once more in the pavilion of echoing jade. His presence, like the sun in late winter, was not warm, but it was a signal. Change was coming. Linhua was summoned, not publicly, not formally. A single word sent through a trusted eunuch, "Tonight." She knew immediately where to go. Not the grand halls nor the private chambers, but the Hall of Shifting Waters. A modest building at the edge of the Imperial Gardens, built beside a pond fed by a natural spring. It was where emperors had once gone to think, to retreat, not from danger, but from decision. She dressed in deep blue silk, simple and heavy, like still water. Her hair was braided low, her expression calm. Ruo handed her a lantern as she stepped out into the corridor, its light softening the shadows of the courtyard as she walked alone. Inside the hall, the Emperor stood facing the window. He did not turn when she entered. "I used to come here with my father," he said. "He would sit for hours just watching the fish move beneath the ice." Linhua said nothing. She waited. He turned at last. "I've made a decision," he said. She looked at him fully now. He looked older than she remembered, not in body, in gaze. "It's time the court had clarity," he said. "They whisper too much. They move in darkness. They sharpen blades I haven't yet seen." Linhua breathed slowly. "And you mean to give them light?" He nodded. "Not a son. Not yet. That brings the wrong battle." He stepped forward. "But I will name you." She blinked once. "As what?" He studied her. "As the guardian of my legacy." The phrase was not ceremonial, not even official, but Linhua understood it instantly. It was a role without precedence, no title, no throne, but power and danger. Because to guard something, one must stand in front of it. She spoke carefully. "They will come for me." "They already have," he said. She looked away. "What will the Empress say?" "She will not speak." "And the ministers? They will weigh what it means to stand against you and what it means to stand with you." Linhua felt the weight of his words settle over her shoulders. Not as burden, as armor. "You trust me with the future," she said quietly. He nodded. She looked up. "Then allow me to shape it." The Emperor reached into his sleeve and handed her a scroll, sealed, marked only with his personal crest. She didn't open it. Not yet. "It names you," he said. "Not as mother, not as regent, but as keeper." She held the scroll to her chest. "I accept." He studied her for a moment longer. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Yun will be moved." Linhua's heart stopped, just for awareness. A villa outside the city, guarded, quiet. He'll be educated properly, safely. No one will know. "Does he know?" she asked. "Not yet." She bowed, and as she did, something shifted inside her. Not ambition, resolve. A decision she had not yet dared to make until now. When she left the Hall of Shifting Waters, the wind had stilled. The lantern in her hand flickered once, then went quiet. She walked the path back alone, snow melting beneath her footsteps. The next morning, she called for Ruo and An. "I will need a record," she said. "Of what?" and asked. "Of every man who has whispered about the succession." Ruo tilted her head. "To report them?" "No," Linhua said. "To understand them." Word of the scroll never reached the court, but the scroll itself reached the right eyes. Within days, the stewards of 3 noble houses adjusted their alliances. One began sending offerings to Linhua's estate, rare paper, medicinal herbs, a painting of cranes rising in mist. Another, more cautious, removed their envoy from the Empress's court, citing family illness. And a third sent nothing at all. Silence, too, was a message. In response, Linhua did not act. She did not write back. She let the court hang in its quiet confusion, their questions suspended in the frigid air. And behind that silence, she moved. She sent her trusted courier to the villa, where Yun would be sent. She ensured that every servant was vetted, that the tutor remained unchanged, that his guards answered only to her, though no one would know it. She did not visit. She did not write to him, but she had a small statue placed at the threshold of his study, a river stone carved into the shape of a fox. Its belly was hollow. Inside it, a folded square of cloth, one thread embroidered in white silk, a kite. That evening, she walked through the Imperial garden as the first buds broke through the snow. A court lady passed her in the corridor and bowed. But Linhua did not see her. She was watching the sky. The clouds were parting. The moon was rising. And somewhere beyond the walls, a child was learning to listen, to wait, to become. And Linhua at last understood her place, not as flame, but as wind. Not to burn, but to carry him forward. The 3rd month arrived, cloaked in the scent of thawed earth and awakening blossoms. It was not yet spring, not truly, but the promise of it was everywhere. Petals unfolded timidly on the peach trees. The moss along the walkways returned, richer and darker than before. Servants shed one layer of their robes, and the palace, long frozen in winter's hush, began to breathe again. Yet with the thaw came risk. Just as frost preserved what was hidden, warmth revived old things, dormant grudges, unspoken ambitions, and names once buried in silence. Linhua felt it the moment she stepped into the spring pavilion. She had been summoned, not by decree, but by implication. A gathering had been arranged, one of refinement, they said, tea, poetry, a string quartet of the Imperial musicians. hosted by Lady Gao. She was no longer dangerous, which, Linhua knew, made her dangerous again. The invitation was subtle in its trap. Not attending would seem cold, even arrogant. Attending, however, meant entering the chamber of old enemies with no official guard, no ceremonial shield, only presence and eyes. She chose to attend. Ruo helped her dress in pale ivory silk, threaded with fine silver vine work that caught the light only when she moved. Her hair was bound in a modest twist, adorned with a comb carved from amber, unassuming but deliberate, the color of sap, of things preserved. When she entered the pavilion, the air was already thick with plum wine and incense. Lady Gao greeted her with a smile polished to shine but lacking warmth. A circle of consorts flanked her, some older, some once rumored favorites, all arrayed like chess pieces waiting for the first move. Linhua bowed with graceful precision. Lady Gao gestured to an open seat. "You honor us, noble consort." "The honor is mine," Linhua replied. "Your garden is always a welcome breath." "Perhaps," Gao said smoothly, "but the air has changed lately. Some say the winds now blow from the west." A murmur of soft laughter followed. Linhua simply lifted her teacup. "Change is the nature of spring." One of the younger women leaned forward, eyes bright with mischief. "We were just speaking of legacy. Such a daunting thing, is it not? To be remembered?" "More daunting," Linhua said gently, "is to be misunderstood while living." The circle fell into silence. Lady Gao tilted her head. "And what is it you hope to be understood as?" "A river," Linhua replied. "A river?" Gao echoed amused. "It does not rush," Linhua said. "It does not burn, but it reshapes everything it touches." That was when the poem was introduced, not by Linhua, by a courtier with no title, invited specifically for the occasion. He unrolled the scroll with theatric grace, cleared his throat, and began to read. It was a poem about a tree, tall, old, proud, but too proud to bend when the storm came. Its roots, deep and tangled, strangled the garden it once shaded. The metaphors were clumsy, but the intent was clear, a warning disguised as art, and Linhua was its subject. She listened without blinking, without shifting. When the final line was read, she even nodded politely. Then, after a beat of silence, she spoke. "I wonder," she said, voice even, "if the author of that poem has ever planted a tree." A few nervous laughs. One woman coughed into her sleeve. Linhua continued, "A tree does not grow alone. Its roots must share soil, compete, but the tallest tree does not need to strangle." She turned to the courtier, offering him the gentlest of smiles, unless, of course, it was planted by the wrong hands. The message landed like snow falling on open flame. Lady Gao, to her credit, did not flinch, but the game had changed. When the gathering ended and the women dispersed into small knots of murmurs and parting bows, Linhua walked the garden path alone. Her breath clouded slightly in the cool air. The wind carried the faint hum of plucked strings still echoing from the pavilion, and appeared near the east gate as if summoned by thought alone. "They know you know," she said. Linhua didn't stop walking. "I intended them to." The poem was Lady Gao's, written in her hand, gifted to the courtier days ago. "She used him well," Linhua replied. "And now?" Linhua paused beneath a flowering tree, brushing her fingers against a bloom just beginning to open. "Now," she said, "I use her better." That night a letter was delivered to Lady Gao. No seal, no signature. Inside, a single sheet, a poem. When the frost broke, the oldest branch cracked, not from cold, but because it refused to bend. When all else had, it bore no accusation, only reflection. But reflection, Linhua had learned, could be the sharpest blade. Later, as the moon rose and bathed her chamber in silver, Linhua sat at her writing table. She opened the Emperor's scroll again, reading the words slowly, though she had memorized them weeks before. Guardian of Legacy. Not a title, a charge. And what is legacy, she thought, if not the quiet hand behind the voice that history remembers? She reached for her brush, and she began to write, not about herself, and the world she was building for him, carefully, patiently, one stone, one silence, one season at a time. By the time the 4th month unfolded, the palace was draped in green. Willows wept beside clear water, their branches painting ribbons across the surface of the lakes. The scent of damp earth mingled with the first sweet blossoms of pear and apricot. Courtyards bloomed quietly, almost cautiously, as if nature too had learned the politics of emergence. Linhua walked slower these days, not from fatigue, but intent. Her presence, once a whisper behind silk screens, was now a rhythm in the palace, measured, anticipated, never rushed. Her stillness had become an authority, her restraint a language more fluent than command. She had grown used to being watched, and in the 4th month, more than ever, she was watched closely. It was a season of rearrangement, of offerings and pairings, of promotions and subtle dismissals. The emperor was making adjustments, realignments that no one dared question openly. A new minister of rights, a quiet retirement of the old palace steward. The empress remained untouched, but her voice carried less. Her servants moved less swiftly, and in the western villa Yun thrived. Linhua had not visited. Still, she knew. Each week a report arrived from Anne's trusted courier, small notes disguised as seasonal inventories, brush orders, or cloth measurements. But beneath the codes she read the truth. He recites verses now. He favors painting, water lilies. He asked about the meaning of legacy. Linhua never replied, but she kept each letter stored inside a lacquered chest beside her bed. One evening, as she sat before her mirror with her hair unbound, Ruo entered carrying a small tray. On it, a gift wrapped in green silk, tied without seal. Delivered by hand, Ruo said. No name given. Linhua unwrapped it carefully. Inside, a stone paperweight, carved in the shape of a crane, and beneath it, a folded note. He misses flying the kite. Says he wants to make one himself this year. She stared at the words for a long time, her fingers tightening slightly at the edge of the paper. Then, without a word, she placed the crane on her desk. A weight, but not a burden. A message, but also a reminder. He was growing, and with each passing season, the storm she had prepared for in silence crept closer to its edge. The emperor summoned her days later, not in the private halls or the library, but in the outer garden of plum trees, a place rarely visited outside of winter. It was a message in itself. She arrived at dusk. He stood beneath the oldest tree, its blossoms long faded, its branches now heavy with green. A breeze stirred his robes. He looked older now, not from age but from reflection. You've built something, he said without preamble. Linhua said nothing, not with stones, not with swords, but with memory. Still, she did not speak. He turned to her. I've chosen a name, he said. For a moment, she did not understand. Then, for the boy? Yes. He did not speak the name aloud. Instead, he held out a slip of paper. She took it. A single character drawn with careful strokes. Jing, meaning peace after storm, or to quiet what was troubled. Linhua felt her throat tighten. It's a name for the world he may grow into, the emperor said, or perhaps for the one you will leave behind. She bowed her head, voice low. He will carry it well. They stood in silence beneath the tree, the leaves whispering above them. Then he said more quietly, I do not know how long I will rule. Linhua looked up. He met her gaze. But I know now who will remain when I am gone. He stepped closer, lifted her hand, not with desire, but with reverence, and pressed something into her palm. A ring, jade, unpolished, old, not a gift. A key. It belonged to my grandmother, he said. She kept the inner records, the names, the truths that no edict recorded. She closed her hand around it. I want you to keep it now. Linhua did not bow. She simply nodded. It was the only gesture equal to the one he had made. That night, she did not sleep. She sat alone in her chamber, the ring resting beside the folded note with the name Jing written in black ink. She thought of the scrolls she had read in her early days, the parables Madame Chi had whispered between lessons, the warnings etched in the glances of rivals, and of all the women before her, the ones who had risen, only to be buried beneath the weight of a crown they never wore. Linhua had risen differently. She had not fought for power. She had grown roots beneath it. Now she held not a throne, but a bridge, between silence and speech, between past and future, between a boy named Jing and the empire that would one day learn to say his name, not with fear, but with memory. Late in the 4th month, as the first rains of true spring swept through the capital, the palace held its breath. It was not fear that silenced its halls now, nor ambition sharpened to daggers. It was something stranger, softer, anticipation tempered by uncertainty. A kind of hush that comes not before the storm, but after, when survivors crawl from the wreckage and realize the world has changed while they waited underground. Linhua felt it in every corridor she passed through. The court still bowed, still watched, but their eyes now carried questions that had no names. Their deference was edged not with resentment, but with recognition. a slow surrender to inevitability. She no longer needed to speak often. Her presence had become enough. Every morning she walked the southern garden alone but never unwitnessed. The birds, once startled by footsteps, now remained still on their branches. Her sleeves trailed against the tops of low shrubs, brushing away dew without breaking the stems. She carried the jade ring always, tucked into the inner pocket of her robe. It was a weight both grounding and prophetic. The Emperor had not spoken of it again, nor had he called for her since that moment beneath the plum tree. But she knew. Their understanding had crystallized. What passed between them now was not spoken, only carried. And then, on the first morning of the 5th month, word arrived. The Emperor had fallen ill. Not gravely, not yet. A fever, said the physicians. Fatigue, a chill taken from the changing air. But Linhua had heard that phrase before. It was how empires began to tip. She made no display of concern. She did not rush to his chambers. Instead, she did what no one expected. She went to the archives, and she asked to read the burial records, not of emperors, but of consorts, the forgotten ones. She studied how they were buried, how their names were placed in the temple rolls, who received titles posthumously, who was erased, who lingered only in a line of ink, unvisited. For 3 days she read, and on the 4th she wrote a single line in her personal journal, "I will not disappear." The Emperor recovered slowly. His strength returned in waves, but his voice when he spoke again in court was lower, measured. He deferred more to his ministers, sat longer in silence. And on the 7th day after his return, he issued a decree. It was not about Linhua. Not directly. It was an edict declaring the creation of a new post in the Imperial household, custodian of the inner legacy, a ceremonial title, a quiet one that held no command of troops, no control of state matters. But it came with full access to ancestral records, authority over temple rights, and guardianship of imperial lineages, including unrecognized heirs. The court rippled. They understood. She had been named without naming. Linhua received the decree in private. She read it once, then folded it into a scroll of pressed flowers. When she returned to her chambers that evening, she found Ruo waiting with red ink. "You'll want to seal your record," Ruo said gently. Linhua smiled. "Let it remain unsealed. It's not finished." That night she asked for parchment, and she began to write, not poetry, not edicts, not counsel. A letter, addressed to no one, but written for someone. "To the one who will stand where I have stood, you will not be prepared. Not truly. No one ever is. They will call you quiet when you are cautious. They will call you cruel when you are clear. They will give you power only after they have taken away every name you once called your own. You will wonder if you are alone. You are, but not forever. There are others who came before you. Some rose and fell without sound. Others burned too bright, too fast. I chose another way. I walked beside silence. I listened longer than they spoke, and I waited. Now, the name they fear to say is not mine, it is yours. Let them say it when they are ready. But never forget who kept it safe while they learned how." She folded the letter and placed it beneath the stone paperweight shaped like a crane. It was not meant for this rain. It was meant for the next. Spring deepened. The boy, now called Jing, flew his own kite in the fields beyond the villa walls. A red one, high, untethered, higher than any child was thought to reach. The guards watched in silence, and from the edge of the city a courier rode toward the capital, carrying a sealed report. His posture is straight. His words are his own. In the palace, Linhua sat beneath the open window of her study, brush in hand, robe gathered neatly at her knees. She was not young now, but she had never been merely a woman. She had been a shadow, a mirror, a river, and she had survived where others had vanished. Could you have done the same? To enter the palace as a number, to become a name only whispered, to grow in silence, to rise without promise, to protect what was not yet yours. Could you have endured the weight of being seen without ever truly being allowed to be known? To be a concubine was not merely to wait for affection. It was to build a legacy without claiming it. And in the end, it was Linhua who had written the final line, without title, without crown, but with ink that would never fade.